Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I guess there are really two groups here. The first group is my transportation class that meets at this time. And then we also have professionals that have come, and I thank all of you for coming. This should be a great presentation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eric Dumbaugh. I am a professor here at FAU in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and the Director of Transportation and Livability for the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions. And what we have today is we have two great speakers. The first is John Norquist, who many of you will know as the former director and CEO of the Congress for New Urbanism for the last 10 years, who during his tenure there oversaw the development of the Walkable Urban Thoroughfares Manual, which has been adopted both by CNU and the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and increasingly by state and local governments throughout the country. It's a landmark document, and he's going to talk about some of his experience with that, as well as the role of transportation today. He was also the mayor of the city of Milwaukee for 16 years and gained international fame by demonstrating that you could add value to communities by tearing down freeways that shouldn't have been built in the first place. And he's one of the leaders on how transportation investments can affect the value of the communities in which they're placed. So he'll be talking about those issues today. We also have Billy Hadaway, who has been a superstar of late. I guess he's getting back from a national tour collecting awards. He is an honoree, or a nominee for the Governing Magazine for Public Official of the Year. He recently received the John Nolan Award from the Congress for the New Urbanism. He is the Secretary for District 1 for the Florida DOT. He also has a very productive, he had a consulting career before that, and then even before that he was with the DOT again. So he left the DOT, consulted, and then came back to straighten out all the problems that John and I are going to whine about for the next half hour or so. Yeah. So I'm going to start off, I want to talk a little bit about state departments of transportation, what they do and how they came to be, followed by a discussion by John that's going to talk about modernism and its effect on the cities, and culminating with Billy telling us how he's going to solve all these problems here in Florida. All right? So first, most of you know this, we are in Florida, there's a newer one out now, but we have some of the worst metropolitan areas for pedestrians and cyclists. The four worst areas in the country are here in Florida, with Miami, Fort Lauderdale being number 4. Though I think we might have come up to 3 in the last one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which was based on 2012 data.
All right.
The 14.
Excellent. So we're getting worse. Exciting stuff. We lead the nation in the number of senior citizens killed in traffic accidents. So not only do we kill everyone at a higher rate, but senior citizens especially, our most vulnerable people. We also have, and I don't know, Billy, if you knew this, we have the most dangerous city in the United States for traffic fatalities, the city of Fort Lauderdale. Right? If you want to get injured or killed anywhere in the United States, that's the place to be. Right? They have 22 fatalities per 100,000 population, which, by way of comparison, is worse than Mexico. Right? You're better off driving in Mexico than you are in Fort Lauderdale. Right? We've got a perfect storm of tourists, drunks, unfamiliar people, the crazy yacht folks, all coming together and running into each other every day. And it's gotten so common down here that cities have elected to start regulating the roadside memorials for all the people that are getting injured or killed in our streets. This came out a while back. This we can thank Coral Springs for. Tired of being reminded about the deaths and injuries occurring on the roadways, they introduced land use regulations to prevent those memorial markers from being put on their roads. Because you can't maintain the fiction that you're a great place to live, work, and raise a family if your children and loved ones are getting killed on the streets. So rather than address the safety problem, we'll just go ahead and ban the signs, right? No harm, no foul if you don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind. So how do we get this? First, let's go back to why we have the roadways we have. The issue that we have as urbanists are the issues of big roads. And how we're going to address these things. Now, we had a very real problem with big roads at the turn of the century, but not the ones that we have today. The problem was that the majority of our roadways were dirt, right? Roadways that were prone to becoming impassable during the wet season. Those of you who have seen clay dirt roads know this. They're impassable, they become swamp during rainy seasons. And then they're almost as bad in the summer when it's dry because all the ruts and grooves that have been put into place during the wet season then become locked into the ground. If you've ever driven or been on a clay road, you know exactly the problem here. Now, the issue becomes when you have goods movement. You've got an agricultural society trying to get goods to market. The challenge was, how do we build a transportation system that's going to cross the country and allow people to get their goods to market with a minimum amount of delay? And there's a couple ways you could do that. European countries federalized their transportation systems, right, so that all of these sorts of decisions are handled by a single unit of government, which is the national one. But in the United States, we have states, and we like to delegate things down to the state level. And that's exactly what happened. In 1916, the federal government passed the first Federal Highway Aid Act. And what this did was it created the State Bureaus of Public Roads, right, which ultimately became our state departments of transportation. Now, they were responsible for the development of these state and ultimately national highway systems. And what they did was they took these routes that looked like they were key towards getting freight across the country, and they adopted them as part of the state roadways. So federal funds would come to the state level and then be allocated down to the individual project at the state level. And to fund this, we got the first federal gas tax in 1932, which said essentially if you want to be eligible for federal aid, you need to have a State Bureau of Public Roads. And of course, everybody wants free money, right? Federal funds are free, right? They're magic money. They don't come from anywhere. You want it. So everybody adopted, that was sarcasm. Everybody adopted state highway agencies at the time. Now we need to add a further perspective about interstates, because this, I think, is pretty important to the legacy of what's come back subsequently. Also in 1919, there was a concern about what would happen if the west coast of the United States were ever invaded. How would we get troops from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco? How long would that take? So the U.S. Army put together a transcontinental motor convoy, which was tasked with moving a regiment of troops from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to see how long it would take during a crisis event. Now, one of the people that was part of this, that led it, was a young, I think he was a corporal at the time, Dwight Eisenhower. Right? He was tasked with leading this movement of troops from one side of the country to the other. Does anybody have any idea how long that took? It's about 40 days. All right, 40 days to get from D.C. to San Francisco. The war would be fought and over before we could ever get troops to the West Coast. So he was intimately aware of the problem of getting people across the country. Right? And this right here shows the route that he took through the center of the United States. He understood how difficult that would be, and he had a real appreciation for the state of the roads we were in. Now, he also had a secondary unique experience that positioned him to be a major champion of the interstate system. And this was his experience as the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in World War II. Now, we often have this narrative of World War II where, the Nazis are beating everybody down and the American troops come in and we save the day. But in fact, most of the battles actually happened on the east. Right? The Battle of Stalingrad on the east, 2 million people were killed there. Germany was actually fighting a two-front war. Right? And what amazed Eisenhower was how Germany was able to resist for this long. Right? From the Allied landing in 44 through 45. And he was able to do it because he was able to rapidly distribute troops to either front as needed. So he could fight an Eastern Front and the Western Front. So when the war was over, Eisenhower did a tour of the Autobahn system that this happened. And having seen what we had in the United States and the horrible shape that our roadways were in, he was blown away by this. He appreciated immediately the quality of the German Autobahn. Right? And that's what brought about the Interstate Highway Act that he ultimately passed in his presidency. Now, one thing that the Germans didn't do, that we in the United States have gotten very good at, is the Germans never ran these things through their cities. Right? As cruel as the Nazis may have been, it never occurred to them that this is something you would just want to pummel right through the heart of your city. It took American engineering and ingenuity to accomplish that. All right. So the first highway design guide we had was dated 1940. It's the Esho Green Book, Policy on the Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. And it's a thin one. It's really more of a brochure. Right? The new Green Book is like this thick. Right? This thing's a little pamphlet. And it's interesting to know what was acceptable in 1940 when we started building these things at large. What we see here is a caution, first of all, about widening lanes and shoulders. That if we do widen these things, we may invite higher speeds, which is perceived as being a safety issue. But let's look at what was acceptable here. Let's look at the right-of-way. A 4-lane roadway, an acceptable width of a 4-lane roadway was 36 to 40 feet. right? This was national standard by the American Association of State Highway Officials, which is, for those of you who want to divide, how many feet is that per lane? 9 to 10, right? Can we do that today? No. Substandard, right? 9 to 10 foot lanes. That was the common. That was the basis. This thinking changed in the 1960s, and it changed as a result of the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed. Now, what this book sought to do, it was published by Ralph Nader, and we know it for the repeal of the Corvair, but it was actually a theoretical treatise on how we ought to be addressing safety in the United States. And what Nader was arguing is that we ought to be addressing safety on our roadways just as we do epidemiology. Right? Epidemiology as a profession is concerned with the elimination of the environmental sources of hazard and injury. And it's based on the premise that we often can't assume that people will protect their own health and safety. So the foundation of this comes from the cholera epidemic in the United Kingdom in the 1850s. Water was polluted, people were drinking water, and it was spreading cholera. And John Snow said, you know what, rather than getting people to stop drinking this water, right, rather than trying to purify it before they drink it, let's just disable the well so that people can't access the contaminated water. Epidemic solved. The same idea Nader is applying here, which is we can't persuade the driver to do sensible things like drive safely. We can't stop them from running off the roadway. We can't stop them from getting drunk. But we can design the roadway to be forgiving to these things when they occur. We can eliminate the environmental causes of hazard and injury. Right? And so to see how this carried forward, in 1966, Senate and AASHTO held highway safety hearings to examine or to adopt safety policy. Now, we didn't have good data collection in the 1960s. This was before the days of NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and the regular collection of this data. So we took the data we had, and we saw that interstates were safer than other roadway types. Now, the interstates, as we saw, were never designed for safety. They were designed to move troops quickly across the United States. The shoulders were designed not as clear zones or runoff zones. They were designed as breakdown lanes. So if a vehicle impedes traffic, you move it out of the way. That was the purpose of this. This was something of a shock at the time. What it says is that these roadways designed for speed actually report fewer crashes than other roadway types. Now, what might that be? What might be the reason for that? Well, taking this perspective, the epidemiological perspective, what it suggests to us is that the roadways are forgiving to behavior. Because they're wider, there's more room for cars to negotiate should they deviate from their lane. If they run off the highway, right, the clear zone on either side, the shoulder gives them room to stop before they strike an object, that these roadways are forgiving. Right, this carried forward some testimony at the time so you can get a sense. I'm not making this up. This is actual testimony that became the basis of U.S. design policy. Kenneth Stonex, who, if you get the Lifetime Achievement Award for Safety from the National Academy of the Sciences, it's named after this guy. Now, what was his perspective on safety? What we ought to do is we ought to operate the 90% or more of our surface streets just as we do our freeways. We ought to convert our surface streets to freeway road and roadside conditions. Widen the lanes. Widen the clear zones. Add the shoulder. Make it as wide as you possibly can. Take the interstate standard and put it on our urban street. Ralph Nader, and this is one of my favorite quotes, so I'm going to take a second to break this down, right? Because this is fantastic. Even if people have accidents, even if they make mistakes, even if they're looking out the window or they're drunk, we should have a second line of defense for these people. The sequence of events that leads to an accident injury can be broken by engineering countermeasures even before there's a complete understanding of the causal chain. All right? There's two ideas here, and they're fantastic. The first is we ought to take the most ridiculous driving scenario we can imagine and use it as the basis for design. So when my PhD is in engineering, when I went there, I learned the concept of the design driver. Do you have any engineers in here who know that concept? What's the design driver? Now, I was trained that it was the person we should be designing for is a little old lady on an unfamiliar roadway at night in the rain while drunk. And if we can design it for her, it should be safe for everyone, right? This isn't a real person. It's an imaginary set of conditions. Although if we were being serious about actual risk, it would be a teenage boy in the car with his friends at night while drunk. Those are the ones that crash.
And texting.
And texting, right? We can add that now. The second one. So let's not worry about real things. Let's worry about imaginary worst-case scenarios. And then secondly, this is the best, that we don't even have to know why these crashes occur. Let's ignore the causal chain. right? If we assume this worst case scenario, we can solve the safety problem even while completely ignorant of the precipitating causes, right? And ignorance is knowledge. That's what he's saying. And this allows us, this idea to get carried forward. So the subsequent edition of the Green Book that was adopted says, highways built with high design standards put the traveler in an environment that's fundamentally safer because it's more likely to compensate for the driving errors he will eventually make. Never mind that we don't have an empirical basis for this, right? We've assumed a worst-case driving condition. We've designed to be forgiving to it, ergo the roadway is safe. That's why we can have as goal one in any transportation plan the creation of a safe and efficient transportation system without paying any attention to safety whatsoever. By virtue of making it efficient, we can assume that we have therefore made it safe. All right? This carries forward through subsequent editions. We have two more after this one, but you still see it in there. Every effort should be made to use as high design speed as practical to attain a desired degree of safety. Right? And from an engineering, this makes great sense. Right? This is exactly how we're trained. So if the Brooklyn Bridge has a design load of 18,700 tons, it logically follows that it can accommodate a load of 10,000 tons. Right? That's about half. That makes sense. Likewise, if we design a street to be safe for people traveling at 60 miles per hour, it should therefore also be safe for people traveling at 30. Right? Does that follow? There's some disagreement here. All right. All right, another thing, this will, I think, highlight the problem here in a second. So we also have this thing called the 85th percentile speed. This is, we go out, we observe drivers, and we try to understand what should be the appropriate speed limit for a street. Right? This is from the Texas Design Manual. Could be anywhere. The same concept applies. Right? What we want to do is we go out, we try to, well, the S-curves were to start here. We go out, we get a distribution of all the speeds that we observe on a roadway. And what we find is, across the board, that roughly about the 85th, most of the people fall within the 85th percentile. That there's a curve of drivers that are going significantly faster than that, and we say, you know what, these people are being unreasonable. We can address their safety, but most people fall in this band here. So if we pick the 85th percentile number, we should be able to design a roadway that's safe for most of its users. Now the rationale here, follow with me here, you're going to appreciate this in a second, right? The logic here, that the majority of drivers are reasonable and prudent, right? They don't want to have a crash, and they desire to reach their destination as the shortest time possible. So because of those three things, the 85th percentile speed should be considered as the maximum safe speed for the roadway. We'll observe how fast people feel comfortable driving, and then we'll design for that. All right. Well, let's take this and apply it to another health concept. You ready? All right. Let's apply it to obesity in the United States. All right. Same premise here. The majority of the people in the United States are reasonable and prudent. They don't want to suffer from obesity, heart disease, or diabetes, and they're going to eat the food they enjoy. Therefore, a safe BMI is that which is equal to the 85th BMI of the population as a whole. Now, the 85th BMI of the population of a whole is like 33, which is morbidly obese. Right? So what we've essentially done with this logic is we've wiped away the obesity epidemic in the United States. All gone. Right? I don't ever have to go to the gym again. Right? Because most people are reasonable and prudent. Same logic. The reality is that streets and populations aren't fixed quantities like water. That when you change the environment in which they're in, the behavior of the population as a whole changes. And the reason these S-curves are so consistent is because when you adjust the design speed upward, you don't just make it safe for these people, the entire population increases their speed. Because they adapt to the speed that the roadway is designed for. They read the roadway, it communicates to them that they can drive fast at a higher speed, and they do it. All right? We widen these things out, and this is what this is showing, is we widen things out, we widen out lanes, and more importantly, we widen out the distance between buildings. We're not making the roadways safer or less safe necessarily. The one thing we're always doing is we're always making people drive faster. Right? The wider it is, what this shows is a straight linear function. The wider the lane width, the wider the street width, the faster people are going to go. That is an absolute truth. Widen it and they will go faster. All right? Now, in some places, this isn't a problem. It's not a problem on the turnpike out by Okahumpka. Right? There's nothing out there. You're just driving. There's no impedance. Right? It's fine. Where the problem comes is when you apply it to an urban environment. Because in an urban environment, there's all kinds of obstructions, right? Pedestrians trying to cross the street, right? Cars don't know where they're going, stopping, taking time to turn. There's all kinds of things going on in the street. And the faster you are, the less likely you're going to be able to respond to that appropriately, right? So let's look at stopping sight distances for different speeds, right? This is the amount of time it takes for a vehicle to stop from when the driver first observes a hazard to when they're able to bring their vehicle to a complete stop. 20 miles per hour. This is superimposed over Portland, right? So these are 200-foot blocks to give you perspective. And this right-of-way width is about 50 feet from building to building, right? 20 miles an hour, 100-foot stop. So somebody crosses mid-block, a person entering that block can stop. Crash avoided. Let's go up to 40, right? Going all the way through the first block and into the intersection. Anybody crossing in this environment is going to be struck. The car simply physically can't stop. And if we go up to 60, we're going all the way through the first block, all the way through the first intersection, and then all the way into the second block as well. Right? That's the safety problem, right? When there are all these conflicts here in which vehicles can hit. And we widen things out, we make them go faster, we make people less likely to be able to avoid those things. And the problem can be kids starting out of the roadway. Kids do this, right? We can blame the pedestrian and say, they shouldn't have done it. And, maybe they shouldn't have, but they're going to do it, right? And pretending the kids, boys, right? Pretending that a 13-year-old boy isn't going to do that, you can wish in one hand and you doing what in the other, right? Like, that's just what kids do, right? The same thing with drivers. You can put that no left turn, no crossing here. People are going to do that, right? These things are just part of the urban environment. People need to get from one side of the road to the other. And we've created a condition where they're going to get struck when they do it. We've gotten the gun, we've loaded the chamber, and then we've handed it to people. And it's them behaving as they would naturally behave that constitutes the pulling of the trigger. Everything is set up. It just takes somebody to precipitate that chain of events to cause the injury or death to happen. All right? Now, sometimes we like to play this shenanigan. What's going on here? This is Hampton, Georgia. Anybody, what's wrong with this picture? No.
Speed doesn't match the design section.
Not at all. Not at all. Who is this good for?
Police.
Police love it, right? If you want to make money, generate revenue for your locality, you set up a cop with a radar gun right there. The road says go 60 miles an hour. Tear it up. We'll even put a little curvature in that roadway for you too, right? So you can bank it like at NASCAR, right? Just tear it up. And then we'll cite you and you'll learn your lesson. All right? I'm going to skip some of the stats, except to say this. In urban environments, when we start bringing these things back up to the street, what we see is that things are actually safer. I mean, right now our land use policy tries to push everything as far back from the roadway as possible. But when we start bringing these things back in, we see statistically significant reductions in crashes, not just for pedestrians and cyclists, but for everyone. Motorists, pedestrians, and cyclists alike. In Livable Streets, part of my dissertation work looked at the safety benefits of these things compared to conventional arterial design. Significantly fewer crashes. Right? Overall, we looked at mid-blocks, 40% fewer mid-block crashes, and 100% fewer fatalities. The fatalities didn't happen. I couldn't even model statistically fatal crashes for the livable section because I didn't have any observations. Right? It's a crappy problem for a researcher, but it's a wonderful problem for safety. Right? Wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to worry about this anymore? No, actually, I'd be out of work. So go out and get killed so I can record that, right? Right? And an interesting thing happens when you slow things down even more. Right? Where, as a species, we're encoded to pay attention to the interactions of other people. We're designed to function pretty well up to about 10 or 15 miles an hour. We tend to survive impacts pretty well at that level. You guys have probably all seen this, the graphic that shows you the rate of speed versus your likelihood of survival. 20 miles per hour or less, your likelihood of surviving is pretty good. Another interesting thing is true, too, that we, is the naked ape, as Desmond Morris calls us. We pay attention to visual features on other people. But we can only do that up to about 10 miles an hour. When we're moving faster than that, we can no longer perceive the visual cues that we're getting from other people, so we stop interacting with them like people. Right? We start going into the car sphere, and you guys know this too. In fact, a friend of mine related this problem the other day. She was taking her son back from karate practice. They're driving, and there's an idiot in front of her that just won't drive out, right? Won't pull out of the stop sign, and she's getting frustrated. She hits her horn a few times. Her son is like, "Oh my God, don't you know that's Kasim's mom?" Right? And she felt horrible, right? Because she was dealing with the impersonalized abstraction of an automobile, and not realizing it was actually part of her social network that was in there, right? So suddenly the entire norms changed. I shouldn't have done that. The same is true when you're a car generally, right? It's the idiot in the Impala, right? It's the idiot in the Charger. It's not a human being. But at 10 miles per hour or less, you start to see the visual features of these people, right? You can see what their faces are communicating, and you slow down. And what this is a study from Maine, and what this is showing is that at 10 miles per hour or less, vehicles yield 100% of the time to pedestrians trying to cross the street. You don't have to put the little sign up there that says pedestrian crosswalk, right? We're paying attention to the visual cues that we get from other people. But once you go up to 11 miles per hour, only about a quarter of people do it, and then it drops precipitously after that, right? Because we go from dealing with people in the social realm to dealing with people in the traffic realm, which is very different. And the problem we have with this urban street design, imposing the highway standards to the urban street, is we take sections that are perfectly fine for the automobile world, and we superimpose them over the human world. And that's what gets people injured or killed. Now, we don't have a lot of good shared streets at this speed in South Florida, but you guys have probably seen this at a parking lot, right? You guys have probably done this at Target, where the car's going, you intuit the speed, you know that you can step out, and you know that you're not going to get hit, right? Based on the speed. Pay attention to the speed.
No, get a buggy.
Oh, and then force your way in.
They won't damage their car on a buggy.
This is one of those things you do when you're a teenager. One of the experiments I had is which buggies were people least likely to affect. And you have the two carts. You have the regular shopping cart, and then you have the baby cart. Right? So what we would do, again, you're a teenager, you're bored. So we would push the carts right in front of people's cars to see how they would respond to them. Right? And the shopping carts, they would actually just back out and push it away, but the baby carts were sacred. Mind you, there were no babies in it. But the idea that a baby might be associated with that made it a little extra special. Right? Nobody likes dead kids. Hopefully. I'll skip all this. I don't think we need much of this. Yeah, that's what I want to say. What I want to do, though, is talk about that, to segue into these presentations with that context, which is we've tried to superimpose the highway environment on the urban environment, and this has created a whole host of problems. It's totally negatively impacted the value of a lot of our cities, which John has become expert in, and it's created a lot of fuel for folks like Billy to solve all the problems that we've created, and we're going to put the pressure on him to do that. Anyway, with that, I want to turn it over to John, and thanks. Oh, and at the end, I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then you guys can Q&A us, so that should be really the fun part. So, yeah.
All right.
Good with this.
Yeah.
So let me. How do I shift this again, Nicole? You told me.
You have this one, right?
Right.
Do you want to put it on the inside the microphone?
What's
Inside
that?
of the pocket. So just
Where do you want it?
inside your pocket.
Or just put it in. Okay. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm the John DeGrove Chair for Sustainability of the Florida Atlantic School of Design and Social Inquiry. I got it right.
That's pretty close.
Okay. And I enjoy interacting with the faculty, and I've lectured in some of the classes, and today I get to lecture in Eric's. And I really like interacting with Eric because, and with Billy Hadaway, because they're both engineers and I'm not. I do have a master's degree in public administration, which ended up being somewhat useful while I was mayor. I wasn't sure it would, but it did. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about was the purpose of streets in cities. And throughout human history, if you go back to the ancient Greeks or Romans or Aztecs or Persians or whatever, the bigger streets in a city, whether it's Damascus or or Rome, or whatever the name of Mexico City was. I never quite get it right. Yes, that's it. The purpose of the street traditionally was three things: movement, social interaction, and economic, or the market. And that has pretty much held throughout history. The Romans did build roads between parts of their empire that were just about movement, but once they got to the cities, the purpose became multi-purpose. The interesting thing about traffic engineering since World War II, and even a little bit before World War II, is that the purpose of the road in the city changed dramatically. It changed to the purpose of the road in the rural area, which is just to move traffic, and everything else didn't matter very much. That has been under attack now for many years, and it's starting to change. But, it's dangerous to cross streets. You all know that if you try to cross Glades or many of the other streets in Boca Raton. And the biggest streets tend not to have much going on, particularly in terms of pedestrian, but small streets like this one, which is in Milwaukee, it is Brady Street, which has an Irish name, but it's the center of Milwaukee's Little Italy, and it's very lively. For a while it was run down, but as urbanism has gained popularity, it has gained popularity, and so it's lively every night, even Monday nights. But, this desire to have the streets move traffic quickly, and you have to understand, I mean, when the new technology of the automobile came along, it must have been a tremendous thrill to all of a sudden be able to drive fast. And so the idea of a grade separation in a city must have been very attractive. Not having to slow down, not having to go through frustrating traffic, but just be able to just whip right through the city. And so the idea of re-engineering the cities to accommodate this traffic relief led to the re-engineering of cities. So this is Hartford, Connecticut, an aerial shot right after World War II. And this is the way it looked 40 years later. And, you can see where the freeways have gone. I'll put it back so you can see the previous shot again. And then also the parking. So much of the land has been converted to car storage. And the value of the downtown declined, even though it's a state capital. So you have a captive workforce, the state employees, and still Hartford has declined as a city. There's no significant retail in the downtown. There's no department stores left. There's some restaurants. The state employees have to eat somewhere. But its real estate market has just collapsed. An even more striking example is St. Louis, which was in the 1950 census. It was the 11th largest city in America. It had 900,000 people. Today it has 327,000 people, almost two-thirds less. Anyway, this is the waterfront of this great city. This is the Mississippi River at the bottom. And the waterfront was started, these neighborhoods were platted out when the French ran St. Louis, and it had a Law of the Indies plan, 8x8 blocks as its route, and was added onto through the years. But then, right before World War II, they didn't even wait for the federal urban renewal money to do it. They eliminated the neighborhood, which, except for the Basilica, it's the only, those buildings are gone as well. The basilica is still there. It's the only building left. But this is an area bigger than the French Quarter in New Orleans. So if you can imagine, Terry, it had buildings with the iron porches on the second floor. It was very valuable. There's a remnant of it down here at the other end. If you go to St. Louis, you can experience a little bit of the flavor of what it would have been. Today, with the resurgence of attraction to urban life, it would be a very, very valuable place. Here's a view of how it looked with the Eads Bridge in the background. And here it is with the arch, which was placed in there. And I've been in the arch. It's a tourist attraction, but it pays no taxes, and there's no census tract of population. So one of the reasons St. Louis declined was that. Another is that they built freeways to the point where there's now the famous bar department store is closed, so there's no department stores in downtown St. Louis, even though it was the 11th largest city in America at the end of World War II. Now it's not just big cities that are affected by this desire to defeat traffic congestion, to fight traffic congestion, the war on traffic congestion, sort of like the war on drugs. The war on traffic congestion led to casualties, and the casualties, of course, were the cities where the remedies were applied. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, right before World War II, and that's the same street today. And they achieved more lane width and solved some of their congestion problems. But there's nothing in Brainerd. There's no significant retail. It's just gone. Now, we usually blame it on Billy or Eric or anybody who's an engineer. It's their fault, but it's really not the engineer's fault. The engineer, every beautiful place that you love, if you like South Beach or Greenwich Village in New York or whatever, if you like the old neighborhood in Boca Raton, anything you like, you have to realize engineers were involved in designing those things. So the commissioner's grid in New York City, engineers did that. So it's not about that, but it's about a lot of things. But one of them was the design sensibility of the modernists. And of course, the chief modernist, the leader of the group, was Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier really did embrace the motor car. He embraced modernism. But he also, at the end of World War II, he was sort of a leftist. He was a socialist like Gropius. He later on, in the late 30s, flirted with fascism, went to the right, and then finally ended up being sort of in the middle. By the time the UN was built and he got part of the contract for that, he was just a regular, somebody who believed in democracy, I guess. But anyway, right after the war, like Gropius and a lot of other modernists, they were absolutely repelled by the failure of the imperial governments of Europe that had created the world's biggest military catastrophe ever. Millions and millions of people dying in a war, a mechanized war with mechanized killing, the machine gun, the tank, artillery that could fire 30 or 40 miles over the English Channel. Well, not 20 or 30 miles, not 30 or 40. But anyway, they were repelled by all that, and they associated the Beaux-Arts and what in the U.S. would have been called the City Beautiful with imperialism, with the foolishness of the empires. And so that just enhanced their attraction to what they felt was new. And so one of the things that was new was the motor car and the idea that you could drive through a community without having to stop. That you could just whiz right through. And this is Corbusier's drawing in 1922. with the steel reinforced buildings, and this is a drawing of what he wanted to do on the west bank of the Seine and the Jewish quarter, replace all those buildings with his design, with just tall buildings and all streets grade separated. Now that wasn't done in Paris. They resisted it, so it never happened. If you go back to Paris, the Jewish quarter is still there. And it's worth billions of dollars, billions of euros in real estate value. But we did do it in the U.S., and this is Crystal City, the Jefferson Davis Highway, just right near the Ronald Reagan Airport. And it doesn't allow people to walk along it. It's completely for vehicles, although they're now changing that to the credit of Crystal City. Now the idea, as Eric said, the Autobahn started in Germany. It wasn't an invention of the Nazis as much as I might like to attribute that to the Nazis. It was actually, the first one was built under the administration right before the Weimar Republic fell in 1932, in November of 32. But the Nazis sure liked these roads. They were quite something. And so this is a tourist poster from 1938. And in the U.S., we also celebrated them. This is the first section of interstate in my home state, Wisconsin. You can see Gaylord Nelson in the background. He was a state senator. This was in 1958. He was running for governor against this guy, the governor, and he ended up winning. But he was in the background helping to take credit, trying to take credit for the interstate. They were very popular. And you know, it was a new day, and the faster you build them, the better. And in cities, even though they originally, and Eisenhower said he didn't want them in cities, he even wrote a little note when he signed the bill saying how he thought it wouldn't be a good idea to have them in cities, and he thought it would hurt the railroad system. He expressed all these regrets as he was signing the bill. But anyway, they had 90% federal funding, 10% state funding, so 100% funding with no local funding. Now, Milwaukee built one freeway in 1949 with their own money, less than 2 miles long. It required the demolition of a lot of property. The dollar figures don't sound that high because of inflation since 1949 is pretty substantial. But about $10 million in numbers from those days, so it'd be like $85, $90 million in today's money. And they learned from it that it just created traffic problems at each end. The node to the north, there was more traffic congestion. The node to the south, there was more traffic congestion. And it reduced the property values of the property along the right-of-way and destroyed one of Milwaukee's most popular parks, which didn't go over very well. Milwaukee never would have built another freeway again if it wasn't for the 90% federal, 10% state. But all that money showed up and it was applied. And this is one of the bigger freeways in Houston, which filled up during this is an unusual picture because they're all going the same direction because they're evacuating Rita. And one of the purposes of the freeway was, the National Defense Highway was an evacuation route from the cities. So that if the Soviet Union would launch and the missiles would come from Kamchatka and Siberia and they'd come over the Arctic Circle and then come down and land on major cities like Houston, you would be able to, in the 41 minutes or whatever that you had from the warning, you would be able to hop in your vehicle, get on the freeway and head out, and then look back and, you could see the mushroom cloud, but you wouldn't be dead. But that's not how it worked because you could see it with Rita. When the Hurricane Rita was coming, the freeways were inundated. A lot of the street grid had been eliminated from Houston, that it ever had, and so people weren't able to get out of town very fast. Anyway, I don't want to focus just on freeways. The other streets all have characteristics that fit on a gradient, from the alley to the large expressway. And these issues have been visited on all of them to the point where, like, the standard arterial street in the U.S. that you would, if you wanted to do the right thing, follow the AASHTO. It's not really a guide. It's a guideline. They say there's flexibility. You don't really need to do it. But if you want to do it right, you do 70-foot arterial with 20-foot double left turn lane, and then a big clear zone on each side. What do you think, 100 feet, 30 feet? At least 30, 100 if you can get it. And then, and that way it would be safe. And then you end up with pedestrians, there's no money left for sidewalks, so they sort of gradually form a dirt path, or you can walk in the gutter. But then on the big ones, on the expressways, you wouldn't even be able to do that. All right, so we came along with this designing walkable urban thoroughfares. Billy helped with that, along with many other traffic planners and engineers and professionals. And the basic idea was to create an alternative for urban context. And the Institute of Transportation Engineers, which the professional organization that represents transportation engineers, were wonderful throughout the process. They had an open mind. They knew there was a problem. The things that they worried about, they argued vigorously. In some cases, pulled the group away from doing something that they thought would be too much. The minimum, we wanted the minimum to be 9 feet. It ended up 10 feet. In Canada, in Vancouver, which is maybe the most conscious city of embracing congestion as a virtue, they have an ordinance that says no road within the city can have travel lanes that are bigger than 3 meters. That's 9 feet 10 inches. So they have a maximum, not a minimum. So if you really want to experience, my philosophy to its fullest, you have to go to Vancouver, which also has the best performing real estate market in North America since 1990 in terms of property value appreciation. Not just because of that. It also has to do with the fact that members of the Chinese Politburo, who have hundreds of millions of dollars stashed away, need to have an escape place to go, and Vancouver is one of those key places. All right, so we also did, because the Green Book, our Green Book, is written mostly by traffic engineers, and it's 273 pages long, whatever. CNU, as a favor to everyone else, did Sustainable Street Network Principles, which Billy also helped with that one. And that's sort of it's a 27-page document, mostly pictures, which you can download for nothing at cnu.org, and it basically outlines where we were trying to go with the book in more of layman's terminology, and mostly with pictures. All right, so I wanted to talk about the grid. The street grid is something that goes way back to the ancient times. And in the case of the United States, our capital had its street grid laid out by Pierre L'Enfant, the architect and planner hired to lay out the streets of Washington, D.C. This is that street grid as amended by Daniel Burnham with the mall in which the Smithsonian and so forth are on. And it's a classical street grid with lots of radials, and it works really well on many levels. It works well for real estate. It's not the only factor. If you have a mayor who is completely addicted to crack cocaine, that can hold down real estate values regardless of all other things. When Tony Williams was elected mayor, who was not addicted to drugs and was very conscientious, did a great job as mayor, the real estate values went up. But the street grid of Washington, D.C. is one that has really done well for that city. It's a city that's easy to move around. And thanks to the freeway revolt of the 1950s and 60s, which was led by Washington's African American community, there are no freeways really within the center of the city. There's the Potomac Freeway that comes across and goes to Alexandria, and then there's the Whitehurst Freeway that goes over part of Georgetown, which is, there's a big battle going on now whether to eliminate it or not. And at rush hour, these radial arterials really work well. Like Connecticut Avenue carries traffic at an average of about 13 miles per hour during rush hour. And it doesn't fully congest because if it does, people get off and take other routes. They'll just get off on a side street. And so whereas the Potomac Freeway runs at about 3 to 6 miles per hour at peak, half hour. And so, having a big road and then having everybody use it doesn't work very well. So options are what a grid gives you. So it performs well as real estate. It performs well as travel, a way to get around, distribute traffic, and it also is a great place for social interaction. The Civil Rights March of 1963, or if you're on the other end of the spectrum, there's all kinds of other marches. The NRA rally every year is pretty well handled in the space that's available. Anyway, so it works well as social space, as does Wicker Park in Chicago, which was a neighborhood on the way down in the 1970s and is now a very, very high-performing real estate, lots of young people. It's a typical artist-rescued neighborhood, and it is congested. It has the three major streets of Wicker Park and Buckhead come together. You can see downtown in the background. All of these streets, Damon, Milwaukee Avenue, North Avenue, they have one moving lane in each direction, and they have parking allowed all during the day, including at rush hour. There's the traffic engineers tried to have time of day, no parking, and the merchants wouldn't have it. And the merchants have a lot of power. Because of the corrupt Chicago political machine, the real estate owners, the property owners, and the retail people, they merely have to show up at the alderman's fundraiser to block any crazy ideas like putting. So it isn't because of some idealistic environmentalist or reform traffic person or whatever that they see. It's because the merchants didn't want it, and the merchants have more clout, and so they won. And so did the neighborhood, because it is congested, but it's congested with people, with money in their pockets. It's congested with all kinds of jobs. It's one of the most prosperous neighborhoods in the Midwest. And the same with Dundas Street in Toronto, which has one moving lane in each direction, which includes the streetcar. And then runs right through Chinatown slowly, but it's crowded. People still get on the streetcar even though it moves slowly. They like being there. So that's one of the things about congestion. When you see congestion in a very urban setting, it's usually because people want to be there. If they didn't want to be there, it wouldn't be congested. Or as Yogi Berra put it, he argued the other way. He said, people don't go to New York City anymore, it's too crowded. So, it's kind of counterintuitive. So, in CNU, while I was at CNU, when I was mayor, I didn't give much of a damn about the suburbs one way or the other. I'd pretend to get along with them. I'd go to the council mayor's meeting or something and, meet with the mayor of Brookfield and say, Merry Christmas or whatever. But when I became head of CNU, all of a sudden my jurisdiction wasn't just the city. I had to think of the suburbs. And so Elgin, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, in an old city, it was a place where they manufactured artillery for the Union Army during the Civil War. And they had a lot of steel and foundries and things. Anyway, it's a big city. They annexed a lot of land, which was still mostly farmland. And the DOT wanted to turn the Highway 20, which is this street, into a freeway, grade separated. And they said, well, that'll divide one part of the town from another, and we won't be able to develop it, and we'd like to have business. Here's a business here. They wanted to cut all this stuff off. And so they asked us to help. The mayor asked us to help them. And so we said, well, why Highway 20, which, by the way, in Chicago turns into Lake Street. So if you've ever been to the Loop, that's the street on the north side of the Loop with the L going over the top of it. It's not even 50 feet wide. In Chicago, you talk about a lot of congestion. I mean, there it is, 50 feet wide. And they wanted to turn this into a freeway in little old Elgin. So we said, well, why don't, right now, to get to the shopping center, you have to go way over here and come back here. So why don't we improve it? Why don't we make it better for the merchants and still allow you to have fast traffic and put in streets that would cross, not all of them. And anyway, what we propose, and I guess I don't have that slide here, I have it later in a different context, but to have slip lanes on each side and then have crossings every 3 blocks or so, and then you could access the retail and still have faster lanes, 4 fast lanes in the middle. And that's still being debated, and the DOT doesn't have enough money to build the freeway, so maybe we'll end up winning on that one. So anyway, the DOTs are changing, and this is what Billy in his job had to deal with when he was first being trained. But the local roads are something not important to DOTs, and the freeway and the arterial, and that's sort of the logic to it because they're big, the state. So if you take a state like Texas, why worry about Austin's street grid? That's their problem. What they worry about is big stuff, like going from Dallas to Houston or whatever, or El Paso to Beaumont. So it's natural they think that way, but if you think of it in terms of a city, what creates the most value? What adds the most value to the city? And what helps that city distribute its traffic? And so, this has been a struggle, and it's where you look at it from. If you're a local official, you're looking at it differently than you do if you're a state official. And that's a big part of the problem. So, what is a city? And if you look at Leo Creer's drawing, about grade set, use, separation of uses, highly use-separated zoning, where, you'd have the civic center by itself, the city hall, the parking lot, the fire department, whatever, all of it named center. Anything named center is usually ugly, if you look at modern context. And then the private property separated. But if you put them all together, you get a city. And that's the way to start thinking about cities. And if we can get DOTs to understand that once they're in this complexity, that their job is to try to help add value to the civitas. And you can definitely see it with the street grid. And I showed this slide once to some road builders. Look at all the roads. Look at all the road contracts with a street grid. The commissioner's plan from 1811. Talk about making money off roads. So we're not trying to cost them their living. We're just saying that you don't have to have everything on one road. Look at the real estate value in New York. And they're tearing freeways down, starting with the one on the west side many years ago. And look at the real estate values. And look at what people are doing. They don't want to drive anymore so much. I mean, some people do, but the trend is down. The young people are much less interested in driving their cars. Sam Zell, the big commercial real estate, residential and commercial real estate guy from Chicago, second biggest in the country. And he spoke to the DePaul real estate fall banquet, and he said, my kids, my grandkids, my niece, my nephew, all the ones that are millennials, they'll have nothing to do with the suburbs. I'm selling the suburbs short. I'm getting rid of my properties in the suburbs. Not all of them. Then he said, listed a few suburbs he liked, like Evanston. But there's a lot of truth to that. There's something. It's sort of like we go totally toward the automobile to build our whole lives around it, and now we're trying to edge our way back into sort of a balance. And the shopping center guys, this is a shopping center in Glendale, Wisconsin, which was torn down and replaced with what they think is a village, and it's been pretty successful. A guy named Jaromir or something or other from Czechoslovakia designed it. And there it is. And it's almost like a real city. And this is west of Washington, D.C. in Montgomery County, Kentlands, which has also been very successful. And in Milwaukee, the beer line built on a very tight street grid right next to a very poor neighborhood with some affordable housing mixed in with high. But this is Milwaukee, Laverne and Shirley. People used to work at the car plant, and they're out of work and all that, and yet the real estate market, $700 million just in this one neighborhood along the Milwaukee River. Or in Buffalo, in the old suburb of Hamburg, where they saved the street from... all right, so I wanted to finally, toward the end here, make the analogy to water. The water engineers have already made the transition. They understand that draining wetlands is not usually a very good idea. After years of thinking their job was to get rid of the wastelands that they thought were the swamps, and so they've learned not to destroy these places, that they slow down water congestion, absorb water. They are setting for valuable plants and animals. And real estate developers like developing on the outer edge, beyond where the water is, because it works as real estate as well. The mosquitoes are eaten by bats and birds and so forth. So even that has worked. So this kind of stuff isn't done anymore too often. There may still be a few being done in Florida someplace, but only out of complete avarice and ignorance. This is in Buffalo, where they ripped down all the trees to build a freeway, or in New Orleans, where they tore down the trees, 2,000 trees in 3 miles along Claiborne Avenue, and Louis Armstrong's old neighborhood, and created this, which is now being debated whether to tear it down, the Claiborne Expressway, and just put it back the way it was. Or Detroit, the most supreme example of destruction of a city, the most successful city in World War II, where more war material was produced for the Russians, for ourselves, for the British, than any other city on earth. And at the end of the war, it was so successful, it was congested, they decided to do something about it. So they started building expressways. This is Berlin at the end of World War II. 1945, the city was 70% destroyed. It's all built back now, except for a few places where they kept the ruins on purpose. This is Warsaw in 1945. Here's Warsaw today. This was actually fixed in 1953, Old Town. Rotterdam, totally destroyed 2 days after the Dutch surrendered. The Luftwaffe bombed it for 2 days until every building was gone except the cathedral. And they took that picture and then leafleted Paris with it so they would know what was coming. This is Rotterdam today. It's all built back. Beautiful. Even though it's an industrial city, it's not really a tourist city. It's really beautiful. And here we are with Detroit, the most successful city in World War II, and it now looks like that's where World War II probably happened. This is a ground level picture. And then in San Francisco, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, and they built a double-deck freeway. It's now gone, and the property values are skyrocketed. They even put in some affordable housing, which in San Francisco would be more expensive than any of housing in a lot of other places. It's all relative, yeah. And they also tore down the central artery, part of the freeway, and just put in a boulevard, and it works just fine. And there's the cross section for it. And then the most dramatic of it all is in Seoul, South Korea, freeway that went over the Chungcheong River, and double-deck freeway, paid for in part by American taxpayers after the Korean War. And it was ripped out and the river restored. And now it's the second biggest tourist attraction in South Korea. In fact, it's the second biggest tourist attraction in all of Korea because there's no tourist attractions in North Korea, or at least no tourists. And this is the guy who did it, Mayor Lee Myung-bak. In 2001, he was elected. By 2003, he had removed the freeway, and look how happy he is. And they've now torn down 15 more sections of grade separation in Seoul. They're going to eventually eliminate all of it, and they've added more transit, and the city just gets stronger all the time. Now, but just so you know, you don't need to be some kind of weird socialist country or somewhere in another part of the world to do this stuff. In Salt Lake City, they have fastest growing rail system in the country with the light rail and with their commuter train, which has 28 round trips a day between Ogden and Provo, stopping in Salt Lake. Compare that to Tri-Rail. You've got a ways to go. That's the map of the light rail system and their transit system. All right, and I just want to, it's not all about engineering of roads. You've got the parking regulations, which this building site was empty for 30 years because it had a parking regulation requiring 7 off-street parking spots on a 19-foot frontage building, and we eliminated the parking regulation, and right away the building was rebuilt. And then you get these mega parking lots all over the country, bowling alleys, a zoning ordinance spread all over the country, requiring 5 spots per lane for bowling alleys. Some planner thought that was appropriate. There's only 4 bowlers per bowling lane. So, but this spread all over, and it led to non-performing real estate. The Bolero, Bolodrama, all this stuff built everywhere, and they failed as real estate because they didn't need that much parking, and they really needed to be with other businesses. And that's how eventually you get change. And change can happen. You don't have to despair over sprawl. This is Cisco's headquarters, where they're lining their parking lots with buildings for much needed housing for their employees, or at least they get first crack at it. All right, and that's the book I wrote. And with that, I will, just a few minutes tardy, turn it over to Billy Hadaway, State DOT, Florida State DOT engineer extraordinaire.
Someone here going to help me out.
Yeah, this.
I can talk plenty loud. I know
Put it
it's
inside.
Does that not work? Does that not work right there? That works. So how do I get up my slideshow? Just go next?
Just skate. It's at the bottom.
Ah, there we go. Good evening. there's something strange happening here. There's a whole lot of people on this side and nobody over there. Did one of you guys make the rest of these folks upset or something? No, it's great to be here, and it's certainly great to be here with John and Eric. We go back a little ways. I'll give you the short version of my career. This, as I described to my employees, is my third and final tour with Florida DOT. During my second tour, which went from 1987 to 2002, I ended up coming from Texas through DeLand, Florida, which is where the 5th District, we have 7 geographic districts. The 5th District is based in DeLand and includes Orlando and Daytona Beach and the Space Coast. And I went through that district to become the state roadway design engineer. I was recruited by our chief engineer to come and take that position in 95. And shortly after I took that position, a friend of mine who was the first state bicycle pedestrian coordinator in the country with a DOT was Dan Burden. And Dan and I got to be good friends. And within a year of me coming the state roadway design engineer, he took me out west to where we did a tour starting at like 6 in the morning and finishing up at 10 or 11 o'clock at night from Portland down to Long Beach, California and back, meeting with planners and engineers from all these communities that were doing a lot of stuff right. And as a result of that, I had what I call my conversion experience, where I realized that as a state, we didn't need to keep making the mistakes that other states made, and so we could do things differently. So shortly after that, we came out with a chapter in the Florida Plans Preparation Manual, which is what our engineers and the consulting engineers use to do design, with a chapter called Transportation Design for Livable Communities, which allowed us to have flexibility to work with local governments to do things differently than we had been doing them. And also the second modern roundabout guide in the country. Back then, the experience with modern roundabouts had been in Australia and Europe, and while they had data to show that they could reduce fatalities by about 90%, we decided that people in the U.S. don't drive the way those folks do, and so we couldn't depend on that data to follow that same pattern. And so despite the fact that we had that guide and we had the Transportation Design for Livable Communities chapter, which I publicized pretty heavily with local governments and with our agency, there was really no support to do any of those things in the Florida DOT. So in 2002, after I got my MBA, I decided to strike out into the private sector, which is where I stayed for 10 years. It's only when I talked to our previous secretary, Anath Prasad, as a result of having some interest in his leadership and the leadership that I was told that he was going to provide that would allow us to change the direction of our agency, that I was willing, much like him, to take a big pay cut to come back, because both of us are driven to make a difference. And and thankfully for me, despite the fact that I'm a district secretary and I'm no longer in the central office, he's allowed me to drive the policy direction of this agency for the last 2.5 years. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. You already saw this slide. There was a subsequent report in 2014 that basically showed the same data based on 2012 data, which is when we started our campaign. But basically, the secretary told the rest of the secretaries, when he asked me to be the champion for our statewide initiative to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety, he said, well, we like to be number one as an agency. This is not a place we want to be number one. And so we set about changing that direction. This is the statistics related just to pedestrians. You can see that it has a pretty devastating effect, because obviously we all know each of these people are connected to someone. They're a family member, they're a friend, and yet we have consistently about 500 people dying a year on our roads. When we first started the campaign, the secretary said, we're not going to stop with these 4 regions that are the most dangerous. We're going to focus on our top 10. But as we've worked over the past couple of years, we decided that the difference in data from the top 10 and the top 15 wasn't different. So we've now added 5 more counties. So almost 20% of our counties we have as part of our focused initiative. It doesn't mean that we're not doing things in other counties, but our focused initiative is initially on these counties because we've got a very concentrated effort moving forward as a result of that. So the things that we have put in place as a result of my leadership and having the secretary completely behind me, we're developing our first bike and pedestrian element for our state long-range transportation plan, which we're in the process of developing. That will lead us to a statewide bike and pedestrian plan, which we do not have today, to basically identify where there are gaps in our system, both for bikes and for peds, and to get those things fixed. We adopted our first complete streets policy in September. The first one we've ever had, and Smart Growth America, the very group that publishes the Dangerous by Design report, is free of charge, working with us to implement our complete streets policy throughout all of our documents as an agency. In fact, we had our kickoff meeting a week ago today, and we'll be working on our implementation plan with them through face-to-face meetings through June, and we expect to have a draft work plan from them that basically says these are the things you need to fix from a policy and planning standpoint. This is the education you need to do. We're involving others in this outside the organization, including CNU, and so we will have, I would expect, within 2 years, our complete streets policy completely deployed throughout the organization. That's my goal, at least. And what we're doing, as you've heard eloquently from both John and Eric, is, we've had a one-size-fits-all approach to doing street design, and we're moving away from that to a context-based approach to bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And when I came back to the agency, I had one of our folks in central office do some analysis and find out how many modern roundabouts we now have on the state road system 14 years later, and we had 7. One that was designed in-house, the rest were promoted by local governments or developers. Otherwise, we probably would only have 6. Yet there's about 300 in the state if you look at the local government system as well. So I went to the secretary and I told him, I said, the only way we're going to break this pattern is to force the districts to put roundabouts on the state system. So he came back to the next staff meeting and said every district will have in design or construction within 5 years at least 2 modern roundabouts on the state road system. We have 14 in my district in planning and design right now. In fact, our first one will go to construction here in a couple of months. So that is a significant change, and just like in the other countries, what we're seeing in the U.S. based on data from Federal Highway is a 90% reduction in fatalities, 75% reduction in serious injuries. You can't ignore the benefits of modern roundabouts, and so you'll see more of them put on the system. The other thing is that we have done road diets at the request of local governments for safety benefits, but primarily for economic redevelopment to regain their main streets. I would say 90% of those have been done in this district, in District 4. And when we did those, historically, our kind of unspoken policy was, well, you can do a road diet, but you got to take the road off the state system as a result of that. So when we started, I went to District 4 and found that they already had pretty good guidance in place. So we talked our planning office in Tallahassee into basically developing a statewide guidance for road diets on the state system. And when we had this discussion again with the executive staff, someone brought up the idea, well, if we're going to do this, we need to set up a policy to transfer the roads to the local governments. And I said that's 2 separate conversations. Whether or not a road should be on the state system is a separate conversation from whether or not we would allow road diets. And so the secretary backed me up, so we have no requirement for roads to be transferred to the local governments as a result. Likewise, we have, in terms of driving the culture change, these are things that we're doing that will obviously have a big impact on the culture change within our organization and within the consulting industry. When I was the state roadway design engineer, we had about 12,000 employees. We're down to 6,500, and the governor's asking us to reduce by another 5%. So 90% of our work is outsourced and has been. When I first came to DOT, we did 90% of our work in-house. It's now 90% by consultant. And so that's the culture change that I've been driving internally, but we've also got to work on the public and local governments as well. And part of what we've got to do is update the traffic laws. We expect the public and law enforcement to understand the laws, yet this is a typical example of how the laws are written. This is the description of a crosswalk that's in Florida statutes today, and I'll give you a chance to read that. And if anybody can explain to me what this means, I give you a prize. So this year and next year, we're in the process of rewriting the laws. We have a group of coalition members, which I'll talk about again, but basically it's made up of our agency and a whole bunch of other stakeholders, including highway safety and motor vehicles, the Florida Association of Police Chiefs, the Florida Association of Sheriffs, and we have a traffic judge who's worked with us on our motorcycle safety campaign, and he's helping us with this as well. And so we're vetting these definitions with law enforcement and with the judge to make sure that what we propose can be enforced and makes sense. But obviously it will help us to educate the public. One of the things that surprisingly, as I was talking with a lot of our leadership about the laws, one of our district secretaries who spent his whole career in the department didn't realize that a legal crosswalk can be unmarked. In other words, you have an intersection between two streets, or it could be a T intersection. By law, a pedestrian can cross at those places, whether it's marked or not, and he didn't realize that. So I suspect we have a lot of people in the law enforcement community and the press who are saying that pedestrians are crossing or jaywalking when in fact they probably aren't, which is a whole other issue. We've got, consequently, we probably have a lot of flawed data. So how are we supporting that culture change? We're doing training and all of these things that you see, the first four bullets. This training has been provided to us by Federal Highway, again for free because we're one of the focus states from a pedestrian and bike safety. We will also have training in implementing our Complete Streets policy once we get that implementation plan. But I want to get back to how we're dealing with the existing conditions. We're using, as it relates to fixing the problem, a 3E approach. We have a 4th E, which is emergency services. But we've in these 15 counties, we've identified our hotspot corridors where we have the greatest problems, and we're going out and doing road safety audits on those corridors to identify the cause, and then identifying what engineering solutions can we put in place to help with this problem. But also what we know is we can't get there with just engineering. We've got to do education and enforcement. So we hand out information to drivers and pedestrians and bicyclists, helping them to understand what things need to be done. And then we're using law enforcement first to hand out warnings when people are misbehaving. And then if we don't see the compliance rates go up, whether it's yielding for pedestrians or speeding, then law enforcement will ticket. And we're funding, our agency is funding all of this law enforcement because law enforcement in our cities and counties don't have adequate resources to do traffic enforcement. So we're funding all of that. So here we come. We certainly contributed significantly to this problem. This is a young lady who was walking her twins on Fowler Ave when I was going to a conference over there years ago. And this street now has sidewalks, but it's one of our hotspot corridors. It runs right up against the southern side of University of South Florida. And like John and Eric have said, I mean, I don't need to, there's nothing I can say that doesn't verify the fact that from a transportation perspective, we have been focused on moving cars. And so we've got to do things differently. The challenge that we've had after World War II was this change in land development patterns, which John highlighted previously, where we separated land use. And as I put it, especially in my district in Southwest Florida, we've cul-de-saced all the development onto the arterial system because that way developers don't have to pay up until recently, don't have to pay for any road improvements because the capacity is already there. And they know that if it gets overcrowded, then the DOT will come in and fund the widening of the roadway. And so, for example, in Lee County, where I have a really good, probably one of the best bike ped activist groups in Florida called Bike Walk Lee, as we worked on building our relationship, I said, you guys, I mean, there's nothing you're saying that I don't agree with, but we can't fix this problem when 90% of your land development patterns are gated subdivisions onto the state road system, which is what they have. So we've got to work on the local governments, on the elected politicians and developers and that sort of thing. Contrast that with before World War II, which John pointed out so eloquently, when you had a densely gridded network of streets, and you had mixed use as well, including schools and shops and those kinds of things. People may still choose to drive, but they have lots of choices in terms of how they want to get around. And so, when we talk about complete streets, lots of folks say, well, if you'll just put in bike lanes and sidewalks and landscaping, then we'll have a complete street. But the fact is, here's a street that has nice windy sidewalks that some landscape architect designed. It has trees. It has transit, by the way. It doesn't happen to have bike lanes, but people are probably riding on the sidewalks. But when you have buildings set back this far, who is going to walk in this environment? When I was growing up in Winter Park, Florida, the retail typically had no more than one bay of parking in front of the stores, and that was it. And over the years, that retail has moved further and further and further away to where sometimes it's 1,000 feet back from the roadway. And so people are just not going to walk in this environment. And as John mentioned earlier, the parking requirements have driven this to a great degree. So we've got to work on land development regulations as well. And something that I only found out, it's been less than 2 years ago now, I didn't realize that the school boards were independent of the counties, and so they have their own problems and challenges. In Orange County, I live in downtown Orlando, and in Orange County, when I put this slide together, shortly after I found this out, I found out that the Orange County elementary schools were averaging about 1,000 students. Some of them are now over 1,300. And yet, the most effective elementary school from an education standpoint, based on some research I identified, was 300 to 400 students, which is what I went to when I grew up in Winter Park. And so what happens is these schools, despite the fact that the state school board only has recommendations for minimum school siding sizes, most of the counties still follow those recommendations. So what happens? They buy cheap land out in the middle of nowhere with no network and no transportation, and literally every child is driven or bused to school. So they're contributing significantly to the problem. So we are also working on that challenge as well. I'm the chair for Bike Walk Central Florida, which is a nonprofit focused on getting Orlando off the top 10, and we're working with our Orange County School Board to try to get them to change their land development regulations as it relates to school siding. You heard Eric mention this earlier. Notice that at only 30 miles an hour, 50% of the pedestrians die. Where do we see 30 miles an hour most commonly? Where do we see that speed limit sign most commonly? In our suburban subdivisions, right? And so we wonder why parents won't let their kids walk or bike in their suburban subdivisions, because if only people were driving 30 miles an hour, but of course they tend to drive faster even though they live there and they know they have kids. Their neighbor kids are out there, people are in a rush, and they drive faster. And then most of our arterial system is posted at 45, and as we know, people don't drive 45 if they can get away with it. So speed is a huge problem and challenge with this initiative. And when you look at all the things that influence driver speed, there's a whole bunch of stuff that have an impact on that. But we do have control over some of those, and those things that we have control over are the form of the built environment and what makes up that form, including the amount of activity you have. All of those things can help to reduce the speeds, and in some cases, not independently of one another. It usually takes more than one. So this is a street that I commuted on in Tallahassee for half of my adult life. I lived about 7 miles from downtown and drove into the downtown every day. There's residential and retail on both sides. In fact, very nice neighborhoods. And you can see this street here called Thomasville Road. What would you guess the posted speed limit is on this road? When I took this, posted at 35 miles an hour. How fast do you think people drive on this street?
45.
45. How about faster? And what I would say is that, you know, we talk about, from an engineering standpoint, we talk about driver expectation, and consequently, when you go from state to state, you see the same stop sign, you see the same traffic signals. So in some cases, we do a pretty good job of meeting driver expectation, and that people generally know what to do as they go from state to state because we're consistent. Where I would say we failed miserably is in sending a clear message to the driver how fast they should drive. You can't post a street like this at 35 miles an hour and ever expect people to drive 35 miles an hour. It's not going to happen. And so when I went out with the City of Tallahassee Police Department one Friday evening, they told me this is one of 6 hotspots in their community, and they wouldn't even stop anybody driving less than 45 miles an hour. So you had to be exceeding 45 before they would ticket you. So this is the challenge. And in law enforcement,
I always do is drive 10 miles over the limit.
there you go. You better keep it below 10. So we're looking at a lot of different treatments, and I'm going to highlight a few and then talk more specifically about what we're doing in the urban environment. Federal Highways does a lot of research, and they've identified these countermeasures as ways to improve safety. I'm going to talk about modern roundabouts and road diets. I've already shared with you the data on modern roundabouts. Road diets typically will reduce crashes and injuries by about 30% when they're put in place. And these are roads, I can tell you in my district, I've got a few corridors that I'm talking to local governments about road diets. Again, they typically want them for economic redevelopment. Typically where we've removed on-street parking, just like the slide you saw of John, and the retail is damaged because they didn't have surface parking lots. So they're wanting to put on-street parking back in place and get the speeds down. I'm actually working with District 5 on a corridor that they want a road diet, and in that case, surprisingly, the city engineers opposed, but we're going to win this one, I'm convinced, before it's all said and done. It's a 4-lane road. I'll show you a little bit later. But you can see here in College Street in Asheville, North Carolina, this is a before and after where you can see they had excess capacity, very much like most of our corridors. That those commuting trips have moved somewhere else, either to another corridor, to a freeway, or something else. And so now you have all this excess capacity that's really not being effectively used. So there's the after condition after that corridor was rebuilt. Big difference. I'll show you that one more time. There's the before. There's the after. So this is something that you're going to see a lot more of, both road diets and roundabouts. The other thing that we haven't done a very good job at is we have large signal spacings on our arterial system, and typically we don't have good places for pedestrians to cross in between. If you have a mile or a half a mile between signalized intersections, how realistic is it to expect people to walk? I mean, there's nobody literally that's going to walk that far. I don't care who they are, whether they're an engineer, whether they're a district secretary working for the DOT or the average pedestrian. They are not going to walk a half a mile to cross at a signal. And so we've got to be more aggressive with the use of mid-block crossings. We've been putting them in for a while, typically on undivided sections where we have a 5-lane section, and we'll put these islands in. They're not marked. They're not ADA accessible. And I basically told the secretaries that does not fly. We're going to put in real crosswalks. We're going to mark them and provide traffic control features, and I'll show you a couple of examples. The city of St. Pete has probably close to 100 rectangular rapid flashing beacons. We'll be using these on 2 and up to 4-lane roadways. They're proven to be very, very effective in getting people to yield to the pedestrians, and we'll be using high-emphasis crosswalks, very much like what you see here. On 6-lane roads, we'll use either the pedestrian hybrid beacon, also called the Hawk, or a normal pedestrian signal. What happens with the Hawk, when you activate the crossing, the light goes red, it's flashing yellow, or actually it's black, It goes to flashing red and then goes to red, and then when the pedestrian crosses, in the time that we allocate for pedestrians across, once that happens, it goes to flashing red. And what can you do with flashing red as a driver?
Stop and go.
You can stop, and if nobody's there, you can go. So this is one of the treatments we'll be using extensively. As we moved in this direction of using a context-based approach to street design, some of our engineers are really interested in moving forward and doing things differently. And so I pointed out to them, we have, by law, we're required to produce what's called the Florida Green Book, which is used by local governments on local streets unless they have their own street design standards. And up until a few years ago, there was nothing in there that really dealt with the urban environment. Everything was suburban or highways. And so I've been a member of this Green Book Committee, which the DOT runs, for a number of years. And when I was in the private sector, I had 3 of the members approach to me and say, we really need something that shows us how to do streets for the urban environment, because we're getting more and more requests from developers and we don't know how to do it properly. So they asked me to come in and make a presentation at the Green Book Committee, and I made the presentation on what could be done, and then I promptly flew off to come do Eric's class at Texas A&M or someplace like that. And while I was gone, they selected me to be the chapter author. So don't ever leave after you make a presentation like that. And so I ended up being the chapter author for the Florida Green Book, which basically, by law now, allows us to do streets on local streets with 9, 10, and 11-foot lanes. It's backed by Florida law, adopted into statute. Because we can't have pretty pictures and graphics and that sort of thing, traditionally in the Green Book, although I did sneak some in there, we have a handbook that accompanies that's basically best practices and educational. So the link for both of those documents is in there. And of course, I shared this with our engineering community and said, if you want to get a head start, this is where you need to go. So this is the framework that we'll use for adopting our complete streets policy in the plans preparation manual. And the fact is that while we use the Green Book, as they've both shared, there was a guide put out in 2004 by AASHTO, the same committee. I was on the subcommittee on design when we approved the research to do this guide for achieving flexibility in highway design. Because if you look at the research behind the criteria in AASHTO, what this guide tells you basically is that the basis for the criteria is not safety research. I mean, most of your engineers, if you told them that, back in 2004, they would have said, well, you're crazy. This is all about safety. It had nothing to do with safety. It had to do with maintaining the operating capacity and the operating speed of the roadway. So there's very little research related to safety in AASHTO, and that hasn't changed dramatically since 2004. And so what the 2004 guide said is this is the range of flexibility you have, and you have lots of flexibility based on using the AASHTO policy. It's just that states like Florida took the policy and said, okay, we're going to use the highest values for everything because more is better, right? That's the typical engineering mindset. And engineers want to do the right thing, but basically what we did is by using the plans prep manual, as we told them there's only one way to do stuff. And so anybody that did something other than that is seen as kind of a renegade or a rogue. I guess I am one of them. And so I tell all the engineers that 2004 guide should be required reading for anybody in the transportation industry. And we're moving away from the design speed, as John cited earlier. The top paragraph there is a quote right out of the AASHTO manual. That quote is not there anymore. Basically, we're going to pick a desired speed based on the desired context, because sometimes we're doing redevelopment. That context may not be there today, but we're picking a desired speed based on the built environment, and we're not going to design it for faster than that. If we want to design for 25, we're going to design for 25, not for 30. So that's a big change in the way we do things. So how fast do you think people drive on this street in Charleston, South Carolina? Barely moving. Barely moving, honestly. And notice there's no speed limit signs on this street, right? Because this clearly sends a message to the driver that you ain't driving fast on this street, and if you do, you're on your own. Now, there's something between that and what I showed you earlier, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to achieve something different. Now, people would tell you, I have many times when I do this course, I have an application called Turning Point, and I give the engineers the opportunity to select the range of values for AASHTO, and I ask them, okay, what are the ranges for AASHTO? And most of them pick 11 to 12 feet. Actually, AASHTO allows you to use anything from 9 feet to 12 feet. 9 feet is for low-speed, low-volume roads. Well, where do we have low-speed, low-volume roads? Typically in the urban environment, right, exactly. So the T&D chapter allows 9-foot lanes in addition to 10, 11, and 12. Actually, it also allows yield streets. That was the one thing that when I put the T&D chapter together, most of the streets in downtown Orlando are yield streets. We even have a commercial yield street. So I put that in there and got the committee to buy off on having 24-foot yield streets in built environment, again, backed by Florida law. And that's the only thing that really doesn't comply with AASHTO. Everything else does. We have lots of flexibility. We just haven't chose to use it. And these quotes are directly out of AASHTO, out of the 2004 guide. Since then, the most recent version of the Highway Capacity Manual and the Highway Safety Manual, which again are used by AASHTO, basically says that for speeds lower than 45 miles an hour, basically that there's no safety difference or capacity difference between a 10-foot lane and a 12-foot lane. So it further endorses what was in the 2004 guide. So this is a table out of the T&D chapter, just as an example. We have already adopted 11-foot lanes in our plans prep manual, and we're in the process of adopting 10-foot lanes. So again, based on context, and we do have to look at truck volumes because we do have corridors where we have very high trucks, like going to the ports. But based on context, we will have as a standard 10-foot lanes, 11-foot lanes, and 12-foot lanes for use on the state system. So one of our challenges, we talked about speed management, and one of our challenges with speed management has to do with the number of lanes. I've had over the years people come to me and say, if you would just take these 12-foot lanes and reduce them down to 10 feet, then people will drive much slower. But unfortunately, I wish that would solve the problem, but unfortunately it doesn't. The number of lanes comes into play heavily, as does the land development patterns. Any of you know where Lake Eola is in downtown Orlando? Just one of you, okay. Well, on the north side of Lake Eola is a state road called Robinson Street. This is the street that I'm helping the district with the road diet study. And you can see it's 4 lanes, and notice that the buildings are set back pretty far, very much like a suburban land development pattern. And then on the left, you actually have Lake Eola. Now, if lane widths would solve that problem, this should get it. Notice, I'm sorry, I should have pointed this out. Notice that the edge line, the white line on the outside, is right against the curb face. We typically have a 1.5-foot gutter pan, and then the edge line. In this case, there is no gutter pan, so the edge line's right at the curb face. These are true 9.5-foot lanes. I live a block off of this street. The posted speed limit is 35 miles an hour. People routinely drive. The average driver is at about 40. Unfortunately, a large percentage, especially as they get out towards the executive airport, are driving 45 and 50 miles an hour. And this street has a ton of pedestrians on it every day.
Is it partly because of the way it's painted?
No, it has nothing to do with that, John.
The slide before this.
Has nothing to do with that.
If you had, if this white line wasn't there, which you normally wouldn't expect to see in a city, it's more of a rural thing. And then these stripes, if you have an urban street, you wouldn't. This is a rural thing too. I don't know if it would make a significant difference. You have to test it.
No, it wouldn't make any difference. This is a heavily used transit route, so we've already got buses running in these outside lanes. Right, exactly. The problem is that what happens once you have more than 2 lanes, what can happen that can't happen otherwise? Passing. And so the person who obeys the speed limit or the cautious driver no longer controls the platoon speed. And so people drive as fast as they want.
Is to allow parking.
Yeah, so what we're proposing to do is, this is the lakeside. We have people parking in the neighborhoods every weekend and then walking across the street to get to the park. And of course, people are flying down there, and they don't care if you have a stroller or not. They'll just blow right through the intersections. So what we're proposing to do is on-street park this entire side. In this section, we're going to flip-flop the parking from segment to segment, which will also create a chicane through the intersections, which will help get the speeds down. And then we'll have a single lane in each direction, and then either medians. This section will probably have medians and refuge islands, so that then you'll have 2 narrow lanes. And we'll get the speeds down in the 20 to 25 mile per hour range easily. And then at Mills Ave, which is a little bit further to the east, we have a 5-legged intersection. We'll probably put a modern roundabout there, which will slow people down coming into town. Yes?
Will that interfere with bus operations on this street here?
Will it what?
Interfere with bus operations in a negative way?
No, not at all.
Even with the chicanes?
Even with the chicanes, yeah. Yeah, we're
Is the goal just to get the speed down, improve safety, to provide better gapping for pedestrian crossing?
is to get the speed down, because you'll get better yielding conditions. Plus, we'll be putting in our RFPs to basically tell the drivers that there's someone in the crosswalk. But also to get the crashes down. We actually have fairly high crashes on this corridor, considering the volumes, which, by the way, are well below the threshold for a 2-lane road capacity. They're at about 14,000, and the capacity of a 2-lane road is closer to 21,000, actually higher. So this street happens to be.
Would you have suggested the same solution if the volume was 25,000?
It has to be studied then, but sure. I mean, from my perspective, a city should be able to make decisions about what level of congestion they can accept. If you ever go to Park Avenue in Winter Park, Florida, it's congested all day long. Nobody complains about the congestion there because it's a great place to be. So if a city, in my district at least, as I'm working with the local governments, if they're willing to politically take a stand on accepting higher level of congestions, I'm on board with that. And that's, to me, the key. You know. Yes, ma'am.
On that street that you're remodeling, where are the bikes supposed to go? We're encouraging a walkable area. I know that part of
course.
the lake.
Sure.
You know, our bikes aren't supposed to be on the sidewalk, and yet here's an opportunity possibly to park some space for them. And is that
There's not room. I'm going to contrast that street with this street, which is on the other side of Lake Eola. This has the same curb-to-curb dimensions. If you park that street and you have refuge islands, you don't have room for bike lanes. There's a place, again, getting back to context, we don't have to have bike lanes on every single street. I ride on this street all the time. Now, I'm a more experienced rider, but remember, this is a gridded network of streets here, and so there's tons of different ways for bicyclists to get around. Every single street
It's
does
like
not.
a gradient where the speeds, if the speeds are low enough. you don't
Correct.
have bike.
Correct. Exactly. I'm going to talk about that, actually. So this street has the same cross-section. You can see it's parked both sides, and because the buildings are pulled back up to the back of sidewalk, it feels much tighter. People only drive about 50 miles an hour on this street. Notice the BMW cheating towards the center line because of the on-street parking, because on-street parking creates uncertainty, and that's part of what helps get the speeds down. Here's a good example of where bike lanes should not have been put in. Baldwin Park is one of my favorite places to send people because it's the old Naval Training Center. It's a large development. I'll show you more about it. But here's a school, an elementary school that has bike lanes in front of the elementary school, which at first thought years ago, we thought, well, this is the place to put bike lanes. There's a big problem with putting the bike lanes here. What, does anybody know what it is? Anybody? Any experienced cycles? What's that? Nope.
Yeah, little kids probably aren't ready to ride on bike lanes.
Okay,
They need wide sidewalks.
that's a legitimate point. There should have been wider sidewalks here. No, what we're doing is we're putting the bicyclists in the door zone of all the parked cars. So imagine yourself or a child, let's say a 9 or 10-year-old, riding their bike in the bike lane on their way to school. Mom's trying to get their kindergarten student out of the back seat in addition to getting them to put their shoes back on. Do you think they're paying any attention to the bicyclists in those bike lanes? No. This is a place where they should have taken that width and put in wider sidewalks because it's in front of a school. You want to encourage kids to walk, and they're going to bike slowly. They should have put in 10 or 12-foot wide sidewalks and not put the bike lanes in. The street parallel to this has no bike lanes on it. People don't speed on that street, and yet it has the same length, same block structure as this street. People speed between the stop signs on this street, so they actually speed tabled all the intersections by the school to try to get people to slow down. So this is a good example of why bike lanes are not always the right tool. All the tools in our toolbox have a place, and one of the things that we know now is that bike lanes are not a good fit in every single location. This is the main street in Baldwin Park. There's no bike lanes on this street. People drive slower on this street than they do on the previous street. And these are 12-foot lanes. These are not narrow lanes. I would have made them narrower, but they're 12-foot lanes. And you'll see people pulling their kids in bike trailers down this street all the time because it's a slow street and people behave. So again, what we're looking for is for local governments. When I present this to local governments, I tell them, we're willing to do the right thing. We've got the leadership on board to do the right thing. When you're looking at redevelopment, you need to take these larger parcels, similar to what John showed earlier. I worked on a mall in Salt Lake City. It was the first enclosed mall in Salt Lake City to redevelop that project, and we completely gridded out that mall. I worked with DPZ on that project. So to develop gridded networks of streets, bring the buildings up to the back of sidewalk. Here's Baldwin Park, just as a contrast to what most of our land development patterns have. You're lucky to get two streets connected to a lot of our development because of this belief that gated subdivisions are safer. And you may have two entrances, both of them will be on the same road many times. Baldwin Park is an infill project that has 32 street connections to the outside network. All the schools are within there. They have a public CVS, and people still choose to drive in this development. There's no 4-lane roads, and there's no signals within the development because there's so much network that you can get around, even with that many people living there. I think they're planned to be at about 18,000 residents when they're built out, and it's probably the most popular development in Central Florida. I mean, the instant the economy turned, boom, they were building again. So what we're going to be using is the transect zones. Eric has probably introduced you to these. We're going to tell our engineers how to understand context, and we're going to use the transect zones to do that. And I'll go through these slides quickly. You understand what we mean when we talk about context. And why did it stop all of a sudden here? Oh, there we go. So again, we're going to, as an example, context-based bike facilities. We're going to look at context, speed, and volume, just like John mentioned. So for low-speed, low-volume roads, shared travel lanes are fine, and we'll put markings on the street accordingly. We've already adopted a 7-foot standard bike lane. Our previous bike lane for curb and gutter section was 4 feet. Plus the 1.5-foot gutter section. We're now going to a 7-foot standard buffered bike lane still have the gutter pan as on new construction, and we can achieve these even on resurfacing projects. And then for our higher speed, higher volume, some of our arterial roads, nobody is using the bike paths, which is unfortunate. The bike lanes. And understandably, because you're still in the travel lane next to high-speed traffic. And so we're feeling like that chances are we will likely end up with multi-use paths on those corridors instead, outside the curbs. So those are the things we're looking at. And I'll just show you a couple of slides where we can take travel lanes and pull a foot out of each travel lane. There's a 6-foot bike lane on a 4-lane resurfacing project. There's a 7-foot bike lane on a 6-lane resurfacing project just by repainting the roadway after we replace the top course, as we call it, of asphalt. So what we're doing is we're asking local governments to help us to make this happen. If they really want complete streets, they have to have a highly connected street network. I show them examples. This is a small redevelopment project in Winter Park with residential upstairs, retail on the ground floor. When I first started doing this private sector work back in 2002, it was very, very difficult to get the chains to build in these kinds of environments. This is the first public shopping grocery store, which my wife spends our grocery money at, and it's on the ground floor of a condo building. It's not a standalone. It's the first one that was not a standalone Publix, has no surface parking lot. There's a small parking garage underneath that it shares with all the other retail on the street, and people walk in. They come in there. That manager was at a suburban Publix before, where we also happen to shop, and he said he sees his customers a lot more now because they don't wait and come in with their car and load up. You know, they stop on their way home or on their way out or at lunchtime. And so not only is Publix willing to do this model, but there was an article in USA Today about a month and a half ago that says Walmart is looking at, this is a 30,000 square foot store, Walmart is looking at 15,000 square foot neighborhood stores to put in places like this. So that shift has changed. Obviously, we've got to work on the school boards and get them back to smaller scale elementary schools. This is my daughter's school. No school buses go to this elementary school. They walk or the parents drive them in. Neighborhood parks. Downtown Orlando is filled with neighborhood parks. We obviously have a place for regional parks, but neighborhood parks are important, again, so that kids can run down the street and play in their neighborhood parks. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how you make these corridors complete. This is a small scale project. I was project manager on this. This is south of Tallahassee, and this little community did not want the DOT to make this a 4-lane divided highway, and so we came up with a plan that would avoid that by using network outside of the state road system. And we said, if you want to make this the kind of village that you say you want it to be based on the charrette, we showed them how this could be transformed. But they have to change their land development regulations. Right now, all their retail is set back with a parking lot in front and a retention area in front of that. So they've got to change those land development regulations. And this gets the street started, but without buildings at the back of sidewalk, it is not the same. So that's what their after condition can look like. So how do we deal with these large corridors? John mentioned earlier, he was describing a multi-way boulevard. This is a project I worked on with Dover Coal. The locals did not want the mayor's plan, which was to put interchanges at every signal, so the business community and the citizens funded our charrette. The businesses along these frontage roads on the outside were failing. So these are two-way frontage roads on the outside, and then you have Johnny Dodds Boulevard, which is a higher speed corridor on the inside, although when that broke down, people were speeding by on those two-way frontage roads. So we know we have to have access for businesses. This allows you to maintain the capacity, the through carrying capacity, the inside corridor, and you'll see that median next to what we call the side access lane. This is the side access lane with on-street parking, so all the access to businesses is along this road. There's a median here. You'll see this become a multi-use path. This is 200 feet of right-of-way. So this is how this transformation could happen. And by the way, their land development regulations were already in place to bring all new buildings to the back of sidewalk. And we only changed the pavement edges by about a foot on one of these edges, but otherwise we left it just like it was. So this is how Johnny Dodds Boulevard could transform over time. And now all you have to do is add people. So that's a multi-way boulevard. And in this last slide, you see premium transit in the median. We left room so that they could either provide premium transit or add 2 more lanes in the median. And that's what Johnny Dodds Boulevard could have become if they'd had the political will to stay the course. Unfortunately, they did not. So our new secretary, this is the message that he's been putting out to all of our design engineers, and thankfully I have him on board and behind me in changing the way we do business as a state DOT. It's not going to happen overnight. I wish it was, but we're certainly moving in the right direction, and I have the support to continue to drive change and force change. Where there are pockets of resistance, as I told all the secretaries, guess what happens? If people run into pockets of resistance within the DOT, because I've done so many of these, I'm the one that gets called, and then I call their secretary and say, listen, you need to get so-and-so in line. So we're going to get there. As my secretary said to my staff when he came down and met with all of our employees, he said, Secretary Hadaway is relentless when he's on top of something. So And so the other secretaries know I'm relentless when it comes to changing this agency and making us what we can be, which is a model agency for the rest of the country. And with that, I'm done.
With that, take some time and answer questions from all of you about anything you've heard.
And I'll leave this presentation. It's yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering.
It's in the page that everyone has a little microphone close over nearby. Just turn it on. Then you're gonna ask the question, but then turn it off. Just talk to me where we want. And please, before you leave, make sure to sign in at the sign-in sheet on the front right over there.
Use this one here.
Go, use either one. You can keep that one.
All right.
That's fine. Okay. Yeah, there was a question in the back.
Sure. First, I'm a planner, so everything you're saying is music to my ears. It's really exciting to hear. But I'm still a product of the 80s and 90s when level service standards were driving everything we did. That really hasn't been addressed. I'm particularly interested to hear how it played a role in the lake roads. Was it a factor? Was traffic volume significantly reduced? Obviously, with the reducing speeds, volume has gone down. How is level service standards, is it a thing of the past?
Well, from my perspective, that's a more challenging situation. The level of service standards, except for the interstate, are adopted by the local metropolitan planning organizations. And contrary to what a lot of people think, we're not in the driver's seat in the way that we were back in the 70s. Really, the local metropolitan planning organizations are the ones driving the widening of roadways. And they're the ones that set the adopted levels of service. Broward County, as an example, just to show you one that's different from most of our other counties, they've constrained their roadways and they're not using their funding for additional capacity as it relates to adding lanes. But I can tell you some of the counties in my district, they're not there. The other thing that I would say that makes our job challenging, as John mentioned earlier, many of the cities, when the interstate was coming along, deliberately chose not to have the interstate go around the city. The city of Orlando is a good example. The original plan by the DOT was not to run I-4 through downtown Orlando, but to go east of the downtown, and the city fought to have the interstate run through the downtown. I was on the original team for this I-4 Ultimate that's being built today with the managed lanes on the inside. And when we did the origin destination studies back in the early, that would have been the early 90s, less than 7% of the traffic on I-4 was true interstate traffic. It's all commuting. So that I-4 Ultimate project, which goes from Lake Erie down to the attractions, is all local trip making because as Orlando developed, there wasn't any additional network built north and south. Same thing with Tallahassee. I-10 was just widened recently from Thomasville Road over to the Capitol Circle Northwest, and it's because during the half of my adult life, the city and the county never had the political will to build any more network north of I-10, so I-10's being widened to make local trips. And that's what's happening in Southwest Florida now. I-70, all the widening we're doing on I-75, all the interchange reconstruction we're doing on I-75 is because the locals are not holding developers' feet to the fire on creating more networks, so it all goes to the state. Because 90% of the funding is federal and 10% state, and the locals...
It used to be.
They're
out of money now.
Well, they're getting there, but that percentage still holds.
That might be a good thing. In Canada, they have no national highway program and no national transit program. And all the cities have pretty good transit. Some of them have great transit, like Toronto.
Right.
And somehow, without a federal or national highway program, the roads between provinces actually connect. I mean, sometimes when you hear people talk
You can
about
actually
the
talk
interstate,
to
it's
each
like
other.
the United States never would have had a connect. Somehow the roads just never would have
Right.
connected without the national government. being
Which
involved.
isn't true, of course.
So maybe the national government should just get out of it.
Well, what John is saying is that the Federal Highway
I
Trust
don't mean to
Fund...
sound like Rand Paul.
No, there's some legitimacy to that. The Federal Highway Trust Fund was last raised in '93 A year later, when I was sitting in our Secretary of Staff meeting in District 5, the Secretary came back and said, if the federal gas tax is not indexed to inflation or increased at some point, it will be bankrupt in 10 to 15 years. This was in 94. It went bankrupt in 2008, 14 years later. And there's been no political will to do anything about the federal gas tax, even when things were thriving. So the chances of that happening, I think, are pretty slim and none.
By the way, I want to congratulate, I was up in Amelia Island yesterday, and I want to congratulate the Florida DOT for not tearing that tree down. It's in the middle of the street.
Yeah, now just to underline two of the things Billy said that I think are germane here. First is the issue of network when you get these streets. If you've got an external street network you can leverage, when you want to push these level of service problems through, you expand the bounds of the project of concern.
Exactly.
So you say, well, hey, I've got one roadway, we're going to reduce congestion, or we're going to reduce volumes on this one, but we've got the adjacent network that we can tie into, and then you do area-wide rather than this individual street modeling. Too often we do that just the one way, and if you want a local example of politically how you can get that through, go up to Atlantic Avenue in Delray, where we're just named the best city, and that's where I live, best city in Palm Beach County. That Atlantic Avenue works because they traded the roadway with the DOT. They said, for this section, this block of downtown, we'll just take over ownership. You guys take the adjacent two streets, which are those hideous one-way streets on either side of it. And now that they've got, and this is true of street design, if you get the first one right, don't try to do the whole thing. Get a block, get 2 blocks, get it right, and then the development will follow and it'll crystallize out. So now that we've gone from Delray being the drug capital of Palm Beach County to Delray being the gold-plated place where everyone wants to live. And now the development is radiating out to the adjacent streets.
Still a few drugs here.
Yeah, but now we've gone from crack cocaine to high-quality heroin. The caliber of drug in Delray is superior. And we've also got the most rehabs of anywhere in the country, too, so we can recover quicker. But that's a great example. Get a block or two right. You can there's all kinds of different arguments you can make to get it through. I mean, in some sense, when I work with local communities, I take the advocacy role. I mean, let's figure out the vision for what you want, and then we can work back and develop the models and the analyses that can help you get that. I mean, from my planning hat, my role I see is to serve the public interest. And when I'm given a task with that, we can work the models I learned in engineering school to do anything. Those things are, once you understand them, I like to refer to them as junk science. Right? They look really good, and they're very sophisticated, and you've got 6 and 8 significant digits down off of it, so it looks very precise. But it's garbage in, garbage out a lot of times.
It's all swag.
Yeah.
Eric makes a really good point as I'm working with all of my local governments, and there's a lot of demand by cities mainly, not counties so much, but by cities to take these corridors, like in my district, US 41, where the retail is pretty much burned out. You're on your 3rd and 4th and 5th generation of retail, and so the tax base is pretty well messed up. And so they want to take those corridors and redevelop them. So we're doing our first multimodal corridor. This was actually started before I got there, so I can't take credit. The city of Sarasota is the one that came up with the idea. But we're putting a series, I believe it will end up, initially it was going to be 6. I've added 2 more intersections, so it will likely be 8 multi-lane roundabouts starting in the city and going up to the airport where the USF campus is. And so when I met with the city commission and the staff, they were telling us about this plan, and I said, first of all, you need a vision. Secondly, you need to adopt land development regulations that support the vision, including form-based coding, which I did a lot of in the private sector, working with planners and urban designers. And then what we'll do is that we'll work on nodes, because this is 6.5 miles. Even if we could rebuild the street and they had the funds to do all the hardscaping and all the amenities along this corridor, how long is it going to take to infill 6.5 miles of retail and residential? It's going to take a while, right? So I suggested, and since we don't have that much money in any given short time frame, nor do they, I said, pick the intersections or the nodes that have the greatest potential for redevelopment, and let's use those as a way to kickstart the redevelopment of the corridor. So that's, in fact, what we're doing. And so that's the model I'm using with all my communities in District 1, which is all of Southwest Florida, from Bradenton all the way down to Naples. over to the center of the state.
Yeah.
We've created in South Florida, I think, perhaps, especially in Palm Beach and Broward, the most pedestrian and bicycle hostile environment that you could ever imagine. And we continue to do it. I mean, I think there's a big disconnect between what you guys are talking about, Billy, and what the MPO funds. And I know they get it, but I mean but the reality is that we're still adding lanes,
Yep.
and we're still timing stoplights to accommodate the car, which increases the speed. And I mean, you showed one of your graphics. You showed a 3-lane or 6-lane divided road with a bicycle lane on the side of it. I mean,
Right.
cheap solution, but that's not really where you want to end up.
No, it's
And
not
so
where
we
you want to
continue-
ride.
And so we continue to fund that stuff. You know, the stuff that ultimately everything you're saying would indicate it should be ripped up and started from scratch. We're building giant roads in western Palm Beach County. You know, Lyons Road, 441. You know, Jog Road. We're doing the exact same thing.
Right.
That, regardless of what you're saying, that we've been doing for the last 30 years.
And I don't disagree with you. You know, when I first started doing this kind of work at the state back in the mid-'90s, you know, my philosophy was to give people choice, because at that point in time there was no choice. It was all suburban and no other thing. So by putting the T&D chapter in place and doing the things that we're doing, I'm hoping what we'll see is that we're giving people a choice that want to live in some place other than suburbia, because there's plenty of people out there. I can tell you, I have them in my district. They're perfectly fine with things being just the way they are. They have no intentions of doing anything but driving, and so that's the sad state of affairs. We just don't have enough critical mass or political will to do the right thing. You know, a developer comes in, they can do things cheap and easy in a greenfield development still. And in my district, most of the MPOs or the local governments and counties have no impact fees. They dropped all that stuff to quote unquote get jobs into their regions. Some of them held out, but by and large, they all caved in and eliminated impact fees.
Well, let me ask you a question. So, like, for example, in Broward County, you know, you have the most horrendous possible east-west arterials you could ever imagine. You know, Sunrise, Oakland Park, Broward, Commercial, they all suck. And so the question is, it's your money, it's DOT money. Why when they
It's the public's money.
Yeah, but when they're being redone, why are they being done in such a piss poor way?
Same model.
Spending millions, literally millions of dollars.
I agree. It's the same model. Again, these are the priorities that are being established by the MPOs.
But what would you suggest? I mean,
There has to be.
Like,
There
what
has.
would you suggest? Would you suggest eminent domain, double the width? Would you suggest flying 5 lanes on top of an
No.
elevated?
That's not going to happen.
That's what I'm saying. What would you suggest? It's always, and again, I'm a local city engineer, so I get a lot of complaints about these kind of issues.
Sure.
Somebody give me a better suggestion. So we get flying cars or teleport people over, we have to move people somehow.
Right.
No, you don't. They'll get where they need to go through an alternative way. If you didn't add one extra lane to a 4-lane road and make it a 6-lane road, people still won't go where they want to go. Is that what you're telling me? That unfortunately is 1960s thinking.
They'll still drive, but if the funding is there from the state or the federal level to widen the road to 6 lanes, the MPO will set that as a priority, and that's what will happen.
They will elect people.
There has to be
raise
a
taxes
willingness
give them
to
what
say
they
no.
want. I mean, that is, you're right. That's a 1960s mentality.
Well, most people don't want to raise taxes.
What's that?
Most people don't want to raise taxes. Last I heard.
Again, if they can't get where they want to go and they have to walk, they will take that. We've
Well,
seen it.
Well, actually, just to chime in, we just did at FAU a survey it was a representative survey of the Tri-County area, and we gave people a dichotomous choice. If you could invest in one thing, would you invest in more transit or you would invest in more highway lanes? And 60% chose transit. By a 2-to-1 margin, the locals want transit over highways. I mean, it's very easy to sort of pigeonhole this because the traffic people show up and they complain, right? But the people who show up at meetings and complain, the local folks, they complain about everything, right? They want more parking. They don't want anything ever to change, Right? But that doesn't represent the full spectrum of stakeholders that we should represent. And if we look broadly, not at the complainers, but at what the population as a whole wants, they want transit too.
It's kind of funny regarding transit. I don't think you needed to do a survey and spend time to see if 60%. It's a buzzword. Everybody's going to say, "Yeah, I want to hop on a bandwagon," but nobody rides on the transit. All they want is that other travelers who are congesting the roadways, they are out of their way. That's what they want.
Well, the only problem with that, and that's always comes up, but the only problem with that is when we build transit, that's not true at all. That every time we finally get these things in, for the most part, ridership, when we do urban transit correctly, is greatly above what we initially predicted. There's a huge latent demand. And when they go, take Houston, right? Houston, because of Tom DeLay, couldn't even get federal funding because Tom DeLay and Congress would shut it down. And they said, you know what, to hell with the feds, we're just going to fund it ourselves. We're going to do a 16-mile line, and we're going to do it right where it should be, right through downtown, connecting up the Med Center. That thing runs at peak hour at 8-minute headways. It runs at capacity. It's the most successful New Start because they were smart about it.
Well, you are right about one thing. If people support transit with the idea they think it's going to reduce congestion, it actually doesn't, in most cases, reduce congestion. Because it actually does add value to the setting where it's built.
Correct.
So like New York City is really congested. If you wanted it to not be congested, if you took all of the subway system out of New York City, just eliminated it, and then said, do it the American way, drive to work, New York City population would collapse. There'd be a lot less people there. Eventually, it would be less congested. Detroit doesn't have a problem with congestion anymore. They've gone from 1.8 million people down to, they're going to be probably below 600,000 in the 2020 census. Congestion is no longer a problem. They have solved it. They've spent billions of dollars on highways, and the congestion is gone. Except
It is context sensitive, of course.
Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah, I think you were next, yeah.
The one thing I'm listening to here, I'm a land use planner by trade, not a transportation planner. And we were always, the mantra is land use is the big side of the coin. And I don't see the connection sometimes between these great ideas and the land use regulations which haven't budged. So take the intersection of Linton and Federal, which is now experienced a lot of development. And what happened at this one intersection, which was like ripe for redevelopment? Here we had an opportunity, and a big center went in, and they fought the parking ratio successfully. But then they turned the whole shopping center inward onto the parking lot. Then across the street, where we have a gateway entrance to create a pedestrian mobility pattern between the new LA Fitness and this parking, they put a Chick-fil-A with the parking lot in the front. Here's a marquee intersection into Delray Beach, which is now the cutest fun town in America. And they can't get their land use regulations straightened out in conjunction with this land. So you can design till tomorrow, but until we fix the built environment in a way that conduces that kind of pedestrian mobility, what you end up having is these people moving from one parking lot to the other. And to boot, these parking lots are not connected because of the insurance risk of, God forbid, you cross the liability line.
No, you're
So
exactly
then
right.
You go from one to the other, you're congesting the roadway. So, yes, you have great ideas. Yes, the Congress for New Urbanism has given us some pretty good design guidelines, but we can't seem to implement both things together in a way to create effective change.
It's being done, but it's still not the majority. But I think the market demand is changing that picture significantly.
Alex?
Kind of going on what was said previously about you build more of a highway, it's just going to be as congested because more people are going to use it. Well, it's like like let's say you have a city like New York City. Let's say you have a city like Boston, where there's a myriad of different transportation options, but at the same time, people are still using the freeway that goes right through the city, so they put it underground. So my question is, what's your opinion on utilized underground freeways?
Very expensive.
Well, it doesn't really solve the problem. In some cases, it's better than an underground would be better than no change at all, I suppose. But just take the West Side Highway in New York. It carried like 140,000 cars a day, and at its peak.
They could do it. They have.
And it fell down in 1973, and then fell down again in '75, and then it was down for a long time. While they debated whether to replace it, and they were going to do a tunnel. But after studying it all this time, there was plenty of time to study it. A lot of the traffic was going from New Jersey, like Fort Lee, where Governor Christie had his interesting situation. Anyway, it went from one part of New Jersey down the west side of Manhattan, through the tunnel to Brooklyn, and then over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, across Staten Island, back into New Jersey. So people were looking at a way to go from one part of New Jersey to another. So the neighborhood, West Village, Chelsea, Tribeca, all the neighborhoods on the west side, they all saw this as really stupid. We don't want the freeway. We don't want the West Side Highway. Let's just have West Street. So West Street went in, and it works fine. It doesn't carry quite as much traffic. It's a 6-lane boulevard, and the real estate market on the whole West Side was, came back to life because people could see the Hudson River again, which is an amenity. So there wasn't any real problem with it. In Seattle, the Alaskan Viaduct, they're having a big fight over that now because the drill got stuck. They finally got it to move a little bit. But the Alaskan Viaduct was carrying 100,000 cars a day or so.
Yeah.
But almost all of the traffic was going into and out of the downtown. So it was actually delaying your entry into downtown because you only had 2 places where you could come off the freeway, and you have like 18 streets that you would connect to otherwise. So anyway, they asked themselves that question. Should we just put a street in, improve the street network, get rid of the freeway entirely, or should we build a tunnel, or should we rebuild the freeway? And they didn't want to rebuild the freeway because the freeway was ugly, and they were afraid to just get rid of the freeway and let the grid work, and so they're building the tunnel. Now they're building a tunnel next to Mount Rainier. It's on the slopes of Mount Rainier, right next to Elliott Bay, and it's very shaky ground. There's earthquakes quite often in that area.
Yeah, I think
it's insane. And now the thing's stuck, and they're $400 million over budget, and they don't know where the money's going to come from. So if you're going to go underground, you really got to make sure the engineering is right. It's expensive, and it may not solve the problem.
We have 2 tunnels in the state of Florida, and there's a reason for that. Not a good place to put tunnels.
Look, and I think the example you said in Korea, it's like this really sized reactive area. It's like, I think lots of those things where they pour down freeways, lots of times they put they put tunnels through, and while they put the top back to the pedestrians.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that, and there are conditions where that would really make sense. If you had like completely through traffic, and there was not another place for the through traffic to go other than either on the streets of a section of the city, or you couldn't like divert it, go around it, find different routes, then you ultimately probably have to go underground. There's a spot in Los Angeles, the San Fernando, going from regular part of Los Angeles to the San Fernando Valley. You're not going to run all those trips over the top of the hill, so you ultimately go with a tunnel. So, it does work, but it isn't a way to solve traffic congestion. The problem with the freeway is grade separating traffic and concentrating it on the street, whether it's above the ground or below the ground, doesn't work with the basic purpose of the city, which, with its grid, which is distribution of traffic. That's what you need the streets for. You don't want to route your major, long distance trips right through the middle of the city, which is unfortunately what happened with the interstate. A lot happened with Milwaukee, which it's ridiculous. Some guy's hauling sand from northern Wisconsin to Owens, Illinois, to the glass plant, driving right through the middle of town. He doesn't add any value to anything. And when it's rush hour, it slows his truck down. He never should have put the road there. He would have been better off going around it.
I guess a pithy analogy. It's better to bury the body than leave it above ground, but it's better not to kill the person in the first place.
It's enormously expensive. Tunnels are enormously expensive. Bridges run $150 to $200 a square foot, and I would guess that the tunnels are probably over $500 easily.
Yeah, well, you have to do it like a public-private partnership. You need goals.
The great thing about public-private partnerships is that it's a public-private partnership to reach into the taxpayer's pocket. You take a lot of money. All the insiders know about it, and the average guy out there, all he does is pay.
Yeah.
Question or comment for Billy. I was very pleased to see that there was this bulletin that came out of FDOT recently, I think 4 months ago, about arterial lane widths and bicycle lane options. So it outlines, again, some of the new guidelines for bike lane facilities and the lane widths. Something that worried me, though, there's this big caveat in a section of the document saying that the minimum acceptable lane widths for transit operations should be 11 feet. Especially when we're trying to retrofit some streets, create complete streets, have transit, have bicycle lanes, work with the city of West Palm Beach. We're having now some challenges because, we want to have bike facilities, we want to narrow some of the roads, and we want to have transit. Sometimes we have it, sometimes we want to incorporate it. Right. But then we have this big caveat here about not having lane widths of less than 11 feet if you want to have transit, which again then impacts the other components of the complete street.
Yeah, our transit folks slipped that in there after I saw it last. I don't agree with that personally. I think the challenge, not unlike our other higher speed modes, these transit drivers are used to driving in suburbia where they have high speeds and so they think that lane widths are critical. When you get into a downtown urban environment where the speeds are low, these are professional drivers. They shouldn't. Robinson Street is 9.5 foot lanes and they have transit on it. It's a heavy transit route. I think, from my perspective, the issue is mirror replacement. And to me, the safety of the pedestrians is more important than whether or not a mirror gets hit.
I worry about those mirrors once in a while at the bus stop.
Well, if you had on-street parking, you wouldn't have to worry about it. So that's something I would like to try to see get fixed when we go into the urban environment because it's not appropriate.
Yeah, again, it's creating those conflicts in downtown.
And again, they're talking about that on lanes where you have curb and gutter sections. So the outside lane, which is where the buses operate, already have 1.5 feet. So now you've made it 12.5, 12.5 feet wide, which is unnecessary. That's the other thing. When we do travel lane widths, all the states, most of the transportation agencies, that curb, that 1.5 foot gutter pan is not included in lane widths. In the Florida Green Book, when you're in a low-speed urban environment, that gutter pan width is part of the lane width. And when we go into our urban design portion of the plans prep manual, my intent is not to include is to include the 1.5 foot in the outside lane width. Otherwise, you have another 1.5 feet that makes it that much wider. Yes, this lady's been very patient.
What have you heard about the discussion regarding trying to modify the impact fee regulation to use it not only in construction of renewable roads, but in transportation and other urban? We have the case in West Palm where the impact fees are being paid for the large developments, but they're all going west.
Right. It's a very political environment. Every county is different in terms of how they're dealing. I think, right now, the way the politics are running in Florida, I think you'll see more of a push to eliminate impact fees because the sales job by the developers is this is jobs. That what they don't tell the public is when they build a school, that's just the starting point. You've got to pay to operate that school. You've got to pay teacher salaries and fund the transportation system, which is typically the second or third largest operating cost after salaries. And that's what they don't tell the public. So that's why I think, especially with cities, I'm seeing more of a drive to redevelop existing corridors because you already have services, you already have schools. you go out into greenfields and you've got to pay all those operating costs. Even if you have the impact fees to build the school, they've never paid for operating the school, right?
Road impact fees are squandered by government on suburban sprawl-inducing improvements.
You know, on the school dimensions, you know,
The minimum
10
sites,
10
minimum acreage.
minimum site size,
Right.
10 acres for a grade school, 20 acres for a middle school, and 30 acres for a high school. That's the recommended standard.
In
And I know
Florida,
in Florida
it's
they-
60 for high school.
Oh, it's 60 in
Yes,
Florida?
sir.
Wow.
I don't know what it is for middle or elementary, but it's 60 for high school.
Yeah, so there is an alternative standard, the Green Building Council LEED Neighborhood Development Standard, which flips it to a maximum of 15 acres for high school, 10 acres for middle school, 5 for grade school. You know, that you could reference that, and then it becomes, you know, like, oh, well, the standard is this.
Right.
And the school facility people, they've backed off. They no longer recommend the national group of the professional school facility planners.
Okay. Well, I haven't gotten to Florida yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I live in Pembroke Pines. You're familiar with Pembroke Pines?
I am.
You know I am so much welcome what you said. Because I would do anything to have a street that looks anything like that. We have exactly what that gentleman over there said. We have one of the worst towns ever planned. And I'm a planner, geographer, and environmental scientist, and I'm actually on the city landscape advisory board. We just got nominated, I guess, a month ago. So I'm hoping to bring some of these ideas, into it.
Sure.
One of the things that I wanted to kind of mention is kind of different from what everybody talked about. Is that I want you to think of Complete Street as an environment that is both a day and a nighttime environment. And a lot of times, when you see all the drawings and all the conceptual drawings on complete streets and everything is diurnal, right? Everything is, all the lighting that we show it during the day, what it looks like.
Sure.
And when we don't, one thing that I'm concerned about with complete streets is what it's going to do to the nighttime environment, which is already pretty bad. And I don't mean by adding more lighting, but adding lighting that is effective.
Sure.
So it's not adding more
Agreed.
disabling glare, that is not adding light pollution issues, that's environmentally conscious and whatnot. I'm also a board member with the International Dark Sky Association. So that's one of the things we're trying to promote is how do we get, all of you, for example, to complete streets be really complete both days and night.
Sure. If I was to cover everything that we've been doing for this initiative, I could spend another 3 hours. And one of the areas that we know, that we found out just recently is how ineffective our mercury vapor lighting is. When we build the lighting, we fund local governments to pay to operate the lighting, to basically maintain and operate the lighting. And two problems. One is our performance standard is they only have to maintain 90% of the lighting lit. Well, what if the 90% is in the worst intersection in the region from a nighttime crash standpoint? So that's something that we need to fix. The other thing that we found out is that what happens with mercury vapor lighting, unlike LEDs, is that after 6 or 7 years, you're at a small fraction, less than 20% of the lighting that you had at the beginning is still there. So you'll drive down a corridor and every light will be on, but you can tell from looking at the ground that the lighting is not effective. So we're going to be pushing to move faster into LED lighting. And at our pedestrian crosswalks, like I showed you with the RFBs, we've already got a project in that we funded in Tampa in District 7 on Fletcher Avenue, where we have a high crash location, but a lot of the crashes happen at night. We've road dyed it. We worked with the county and road dyed that corridor, and we put in the RFBs. And what we've got there is we have LED lighting, so when the pedestrian activates the RFB, the lighting jumps up in intensity from a lower level intensity, so that will also help to get the driver's attention. So we're looking at using that as a statewide
I'll talk to you a
treatment.
little bit more afterwards because I don't want to tie up
Okay.
everybody else. But I'm also concerned with when we say LED, to me, it's more than just about having an efficient light source.
It's got to be in the right place.
It has to be the right place.
And
It
that's
has
what
to
we're-
be shielded. It has to be the
Those are all
overlighting
things.
it.
Those are all things that we've got as part of our plan.
Billy, let me ask you, what do you do like at interchanges? Like, for example, you have I-95, good example, I-95 in Atlantic, in Delray. Going into this cute little downtown area, but you literally would be risking your life to try to get from the east side of 95 to the west side of 95. And by the way, on the west side of 95, there happens to be a tri-rail station there.
Sure.
I actually did it. My wife and I rode our bikes up there one day. We tried to, we live in Fort Lauderdale. So we rode our bikes to Delray. We said, screw it, we're not going to ride all the way home. We're going to take tri-rail home.
Sure.
So, but it is scary. It is scary to get across.
We have plenty of those places.
Every single interchange.
And the question is, what do you do? The question is that at every...
My question is, what is DOT doing to make sure that you don't keep creating more and more of these things?
Well, that's what we're doing right now. That's what I'm telling you. We are changing the way we do business. So it's not going to turn around overnight. It's not going to turn around overnight. The analogy I use is seatbelt use in the state of Florida. Back in the mid-'90s, when I was the state roadway design engineer, only about 50% of our citizens wore seatbelts. Now we're over 90%. It's going to take time. And so
Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yeah, I mean,
Miami wasn't even built.
I mean, we're overcoming 70 years of this culture. It's not going to turn on a dime.
No, I hear that, but here's what my issue is when I see you dropping millions of dollars. I mean, that interchange was just redone, okay, like in the last 5 years.
Sure.
Why didn't you put lights underneath Atlantic so that if it was at night and you wanted to ride your bike or walk through there, you wouldn't feel like you might get mugged? Why didn't you put pedestrian crossings across every interchange? You just did it. You literally just did it. So why didn't you do that stuff?
Well, because we didn't have this focus back then. This focused initiative is less than 3 years old. That's the answer. And what we were doing before was not solving the problem. And so we've got to do things differently. And we're going to be doing a lot of retrofitting. And I can tell you, it's not going to create the ideal. But what we need to do is do the best we can. And we have not done as good a job as we should have, but that's what's changing. I mean, the leadership has not been supportive to these kinds of initiatives before because the public, by and large, wanted and got exactly what they asked for. Yes, sir.
About how far out does FDOT plan capacity expansions? 10 years?
Well, we have a long-range transportation plan, but when you look at what I consider the reality, it's a 5-year adopted work program.
So the 5-year work program is...
5-year adopted work program. But if we were, let's say we were doing a study for anything, if we're using federal funds to do a study, let's say we're doing a study to replace an intercoastal waterway bridge, and we're doing a PD&E study to replace that bridge. From the beginning we program that until it's built as many times 10 years because of the federal process.
Right.
Yes.
One thing that caught my attention that you mentioned was that in many instances we are now starting to move away from building on-street bicycle facilities, and you may shift to multi-purpose facilities, off-road multi-purpose facilities. My only concern with that is, again, depending upon the location of those, if we're talking urban, suburban locations, then you have the multitude of curb cuts, driveways, which makes it a lot more dangerous if we're just removing the bike lane on street and then putting this facility. But again, you have all those driveways and curb cuts. It's making it a lot worse. So that was my only.
Sure. Well, and where we tend to have these corridors that are high speed, high volume, we have controlled access. We don't have nearly as many driveways, and those are the corridors that we're talking about primarily. But even with that, we still have to educate the cyclists because they're riding on sidewalks today. They're just 5-foot sidewalks with all these curb cuts. We've got to educate the cyclists as well. because highway safety and motor vehicles just doesn't have the funds. We're doing it. Yes, this gentleman right here.
So I'm a bicycle commuter on a 6-lane arterial. I cross over 95 twice a day, and it's hell. It's hell every single day. And I'm serious, it sucks. But are there specific designs in mind to retrofit these? I know it takes time, but I mean, I don't know how you redesign something like that.
Some things are not fixable, honestly. I mean, we can't fix. We cannot fix every condition, unfortunately. I wish we could, honestly, but some conditions are worse than others. Hopefully we can change. Part of the culture change has to be in the driver behavior. When I first went to Portland, probably over 15 years ago, it was not what it is today. I mean, there weren't nearly as many cyclists. There was hardly anybody commuting back then.
They were about to build a Mount Hood Expressway.
Right. And the driver behavior has changed out there, and that's what it's going to take here as well. I bike commute to the gym every morning. I lead a 40-mile group ride every weekend, and part of what I'm doing through that effort is trying to change the way bicyclists interact with the motoring public so that we can create respect in both directions.
But at what point, when there's a certain number of deaths on an interchange, you say this is unacceptable? I mean, like Blades of 95, you guys know locally here. I mean, we have so many bike commuters on that road, and they're not doing it by choice. They're restaurant workers and they're students. And at what point do you say, okay, this is unchangeable, unfixable. Let's build a bridge over 95 at a different spot? I mean, at a certain point, this is unacceptable.
Well, that's what that's what the high crash corridors are doing, is we're looking at what we need to do differently because we haven't been adequately addressing the problem before.
I should just add, too, that you've got our safety guy from DOT is a cyclist.
Yeah.
That's great. It's phenomenal.
One question for you. I have a situation where there is a high-speed roadway, 45 miles posted design speed, and about 48,000 daily vehicles, very heavy travel, tons of curb cuts and businesses everywhere. 6-foot sidewalk and 4-foot bike lanes.
Okay.
I observed that 90% of bikes are using sidewalk.
Exactly.
And there are a lot of pedestrians.
Same thing with the Orlando
hitting
area.
If we combine that to 10-foot sidewalk,
right,
it will be probably a better situation or not for the sidewalk. And one thing is, the biking community, the serious biking community, will always be against it. Number one, on the bike lanes.
Well, but see, they want to ride in the road anyway, and many of them don't even want bike lanes. I mean, when my group ride, we have anywhere from 10 to 25 riders. And the fact is that when you're doing a group ride like that, it's better for the motorist for you to just take the lane, first of all, because you can't share a lane. There is no, especially with the new 3-foot move over law, there is no such thing as a shared lane. We're going to try to strike that and eventually move to where the move over law for bicyclists is the same as it is for emergency vehicles and that sort of thing. So you have to change lanes. Because the fact is, that's what they have to do anyway. And and it makes, for those passing the pelotons, the grouping of bicyclists, they have half as much distance to get around, and for the side streets, they can wait half as long. So there's benefits to the cyclist taking the lane. And I think in those conditions that, moving that width into the sidewalk may make a difference. And then you have to get out there and aggressively educate the cyclists so they don't put themselves in a dangerous condition at the driveway.
And then the other thing to follow up with that is when you put the stripe lane in there, you create the legal obligation for the cyclist to use it, even if it's inappropriate for them to do so.
Yeah.
The street cyclists don't want it. So the multi-use path gets those like me. I won't ever ride in the streets here. They get us on the 10-mile-per-hour path where we're fine. They let Billy legally take the lane and overtake cars because he's going 45.
Do you have any example in state like that where you guys took that and combined the bicycle lane with the sidewalk?
We have not done that from a policy standpoint yet. We're having discussions about it.
Okay.
There are some already out there where we've worked with local governments who want to create connections between multi-use trails that go out through old railroad corridors or whatever, and they want to connect let's say two trails together, and they've got a mile or two of segment that's along a state road system. So we put in multi-use trails in those places and didn't put a sidewalk in also. I mean, we put in one or the other. So we have done that already, yes. It just wasn't a policy. Yeah, in Seminole County and Orlando, there's one I ride all the time.
And then for time, we're going to do 2 more questions because we're running short. So, yeah.
Someone that hasn't asked a question after you.
I'm with the City of Boynton Beach. We're very excited and hoping to modify Boynton Beach Boulevard, similar to how you described some beautifications of the roadways you've worked on. I guess twofold question. Are things coming out of DOT that you're talking about, some of these pending policy reports, standard changes that possibly will help us in our charge? Timing is everything, if you will. Is there a better time that we should be petitioning and working on this? Our CRA office is currently working with Kimley Horn, who's coordinating with DOT.
Okay.
But what advice can you give me, or what outlook can you share that maybe a better horizon down the road to be working toward this?
We're moving pretty fast, so I think it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. This district, you're in District 4, and District 4 has historically been one of our more progressive districts. When we adopted the Transportation Design for Livable Communities chapter in 96 or 97, they were really the only ones that have ever used it. The rest of the districts just ignored it like it didn't exist. Wow. So they have pretty good folks there, in my experience. And there was one person that was probably creating some pushback on these kinds of principles. And as I've gone around and made presentations, I've presented to every single specialty group within the agency, including all the district design engineers. And that particular guy was one that came up to me afterwards and said, I finally get what it is you've been trying to tell me for some time now. So I'm hopeful that things are changing even better. Back when Rick Tresser was the secretary in District 4, they were clearly on board, but they kind of had gone backwards, in my opinion.
You've also got just some things you have down here that I'm beginning to appreciate more than I did before. It's easy to hurl invective at the DOT, but the county engineer has a lot of control over the simple fixes. And they are obstinate in a way that I don't think anybody from our DOT is. So I would
agree.
So I would also, depending on the nature of the thing, they're really you can get them from both ends. You can get them from the DOT and from the local.
But what happens many times is that they blame us when it's really their agenda, just like the city engineer in the city of Orlando. Nice guy, but he's opposed to everything that we're trying to do, pretty much.
My hands are tied.
Well, stop giving him money.
We don't give him any money.
All right, yeah.
I was wondering, being that you from the Orlando area, how do you feel that the new I-4 renovation that they're doing to that area, to I-4 specifically?
I-4
Yeah, how do you feel about how will the impact be? How in 2021, I believe, as we be finished. What kind of impact do you think that would have?
Which impacts are you referring to? Because there's all kinds of impacts.
Well, because it's really congested on how far I know. Do you think the new express lanes and the new widening will that kind of relieve some kind of traffic flow?
I commute every day on I-4. When I took this job in District 1, the secretary asked me to actually take a secretary's job instead of a job in District 5 where I could have bike commuted to the urban office, unfortunately. But anyway, so I took this job because he wanted me to help drive change and to lead this statewide initiative. And so I commute 60 miles each way every day. And I tell you, doing reverse commutes, there's really not a congestion problem. Where there are congestion problems is coming in the morning, obviously, because